PR department, and I could build.
You don't see this right now replacing things like ADOs and professional quality broadcast effects equipment, do you, or do you, Tim?
Well, I do, because even if
crime, making fun of Fox News and their religious fanaticism. Nowadays it's CNN that keeps being brought up, and I think it's because not only do they try to, I guess, attack the orange man, but they're also trying to do damage control every time the Democrats say something stupid. Imagine being a journalist like Chris Cuomo at CNN and going like, what did the Democrats say? Oh, fucking hell, like, how are we going to spin this? Like, just watch this segment where they are basically saying that concentration camps have nothing to do with National Socialism. Nothing to do. However, saying "Make America Great Again," that is definitely Hitler-esque. I suppose that might be the Netflix adaptation of the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany. Like that's definitely going to be in there. It's going to have Mr. Adolf going like, "We need to make America great again."
Steve Cortez with the new definition from her. I say concentration camps because that's how they are defined internationally. That's what these are. I am not equating with stigma of the Nazis and the Jews. Leave that part aside. Satisfied?
No, Chris, that's a ridiculous excuse for a couple of reasons. First of all, we all know what the connotation of concentration camps is. If we went out on the street and asked 100 random people, 99 of them would tell us, would give us an explanation or a definition that relates to Nazism. But secondly, and even more importantly, she used the phrase "never again," which we know is specifically linked to the Holocaust, to the Shoah. And by doing that, she very much demeaned the victims of the Shoah, the victims of that horrific tragedy. She also demeaned, by the way, the American soldiers that smashed the evil perpetrators of that human tragedy. And I would also add this. She also demeans the current American citizens, many of whom are Hispanic, who do the very hard and dangerous work of guarding our borders. She equated them by association to Nazi SS guards, and that is disgraceful. AOC should apologize at the least and probably resign.
One point of pushback before I get to you, Angela. You did not have similar problems with the phrase "America First," which is equally stained, or the word "nationalist," which is equally stained. No, yes, as a matter of fact, but why doesn't it bother you the same way?
You and I have had this discussion many times about nationalism. I totally disagree that it's a stained word. As a matter of fact, I think it's a proud word. American well, no, I'm not wrong. You don't get to define what nationalism means for me.
Because nationalism has been used.
No, you don't.
Almost I'll make you a bet. Steve, let me know what movement defined itself as nationalism that was positive and not oppressive to another.
What? American nationalism, and it was American nationalism that landed on the shores. Yes, there is. Look, American nationalism, unlike ethno-fascism, you're trying to conflate these terms.
Oh my God. I've got an idea. 6 months to get those celebrities up here right away. Yes, I got something wrong. People want to see more than a color. A cancer riddled puppy. 70, 80. Oh, I'm going home to see him online. That's right, guys. Okay, my neighbor lives in Morais. Oh, look at the little guy. His dad's A-list and his mom's B-list. So it's a B plus right off the bat. Yeah! Oh, this is another step. sugar. You jerks are a lot of speed. You think so? I'll be back, Mr. Smith. The broken metal film is even sadder than Oscar Gold. There's 6 hours of a baby shit trying to revive its dead mother. Mike, you're the worst contractor ever!
But they melt together and now they're Americans. So, chauvinism, unlike nationalism, is the belief that your people are superior.
This is Abby. She and her husband, Tom, are trying to start a family while struggling to afford the high cost of living in California. Abby and Tom have been saving every penny that they can to afford the down payment on a new home, which they're hoping to move into before their first child arrives. This has been no easy task, given that homes in California are more than 2 times as expensive as they are in the rest of the country. Abby and Tom finally have enough to begin searching for a home when
Mass and so it is decided that all new homes must be built with solar panels.
"Ah, but won't that increase the cost of the average home by $10,000? And won't the cost of inspections, cleanings, and repairs also cost homeowners an average of another $1,000 annually? And isn't California already the poorest state in the union when factoring in cost of living? Wouldn't this likely be the biggest and costliest change in the last 40 years of the CPIA's history, at a time when regular Californians are struggling horribly?"
No! Now we'll never be able to afford a home.
But at least the environment will be helped? Maybe, maybe not. Solar energy has its benefits, sure, but it has a lot of drawbacks as well. Because most energy consumption takes place at night when the sun isn't shining, lots of energy needs to be stored in batteries, which are terrible for the environment. Not only that, but it's extremely expensive. Germany, which leads the world in solar energy consumption, has some of the highest utility bills because of it, and solar still only accounts for less than 10% of their energy consumption.
Unsupported.
I guess not everyone can appreciate the genius of our policymaking.
Hey folks, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please check out fee.org for more educational content. Thank you.
Modern city home to over 100,000.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 30 Years of Failed Climate Predictions. 30 years ago today, NASA's James Hansen testified before Congress. Here's how Fox News described it. NASA's chilling 30-year-old warning. We were warned. On June 23, 1988, a sultry day in Washington, James Hansen told the U.S. Congress and the world that global warming wasn't approaching, it had already arrived. The testimony of the top NASA scientist was the opening salvo of the age of climate change. 30 years later, it's clear that Hansen and other doomsayers were right, but the change has been so sweeping that it's easy to lose sight of effects large and small, some obvious, others less conspicuous. Earth is noticeably hotter, the weather stormier and more extreme. Polar regions have lost billions of tons of ice. Sea levels have been raised by trillions of gallons of water. Far more wildfires rage. Wow, this all sounds really bad. If Fox News says it, it must be true. Well, let's go back in time 30 years and see what's actually happened. 30 years ago today, James Hansen testified before the Senate. He said, global warming has begun. Sharp cut and burning of fossil fuels is urged to battle shift in climate. But the war against fossil fuels didn't actually begin that day. It began more than a decade earlier when President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, warned the United States we needed to cut back on our energy usage. August 11th, 1975, Berkeley, California. The United States is threatened far more by the hazards of too much energy too soon than by the hazards of too little too late. The hazards of too much, which have been widely underestimated as the liabilities of too little, have been exaggerated, include diverting financial resources from compelling social needs, making hasty commitments to unproved technologies, and generating environmental and social costs that harm human welfare far more than the extra energy improves it. Nothing Holdren said made any sense or had any basis in reality, but that was fairly typical of his genre. Now let's jump to June 22nd, 1988, the day before Hansen's testimony to Congress. Hansen's testimony was organized by Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado. We called the Weather Bureau and found out what historically was the hottest day of summer. So we scheduled the hearing that day, and bingo, it was the hottest day on record in Washington or close to it. It was stiflingly hot that summer. What we did was went in the night before and opened all the windows. I'll admit it, right? So that the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room. So Hansen's giving this testimony. You've got those television cameras back there heating up the room, and the air conditioning in the room didn't appear to work. So it was a perfect collection of events that happened that day, with the wonderful Jim Hansen, who was wiping his brow at the witness table and giving this remarkable testimony. Senator Wirth was right. June 22nd, 1988 was by far the hottest June 22nd on record in the United States. 71% of the U.S. was over 90 degrees that day. Generally, June 22nd temperatures have declined in the U.S. over the last century, but 1988 was a major exception. It was really hot that day, and Senator Wirth and James Hansen went in and sabotaged the air conditioner at Congress the night before. This map shows temperatures on June 22nd, 1988. The yellow dots represent over 90 degrees, and you can see that almost the entire country was over 90 degrees. And the red dots represent 100 degrees. You can see there's 100-degree temperatures coast to coast, including in the Washington, D.C. area. This graph shows June 22nd temperatures at Lincoln, Virginia, just west of Washington, D.C. You can see that they've generally declined about 3 degrees over the last 90 years. But 1988, it was very hot that day. This year was one of the coolest on record in the D.C. area, though. 66 degrees was the forecast high yesterday at Winchester, Virginia. So temperatures in the Washington, D.C. area were almost 30 degrees cooler this year than they were 30 years ago in 1988. But it wasn't just hot during the summer of 1988. There was also a terrible drought covering the country. The Mississippi River nearly dried up that summer. West Tennessee is shriveling in a drought, and nobody's sure what's causing it or when it will end. While scientists and weather experts toss around theories about sunspot cycles and Pacific sea surface temperatures, rain clouds continue to elude the area, and everything keeps getting drier and drier. This article was dated June 19, 1988, and 4 days later, James Hansen came to Congress, and he definitively told everyone what was causing the heat and drought. It was emissions from their automobiles. They needed to quit driving. Everything was so simple now. This farmer's tractor was causing the heat and drought, which was ruining his farm. There were many dry years in the 1980s, but the drought of 1988 was the worst, and low water levels forced hydroelectric plants to shut down. The heat and drought led to massive fires that summer. In fact, Yellowstone National Park nearly burned up. So the stage was set for...
Que ao contrário de atualmente, que os ensinos atualmente são feitos simples. Acontece, são ou origem criminosa, que também, como não me dá muito a pena máxima em Portugal, não interessa se A pena máxima em Portugal é ridícula. A pena máxima em Portugal devia ser prisão perpétua. A prisão perpétua e pelo menos 36 anos, pelo menos só ao fim de 36 anos é que podia sair em liberdade condicional. E, mesmo assim, 36 anos não, 37 anos, e só ao fim de 36 anos é que podia eventualmente se candidatar a liberdade condicional.
Hansen, it was extremely hot, it was extremely dry, and there were fires burning. Well, Fox News says that Hansen got everything right. So now let's look at Hansen's specific predictions and see if Fox News is correct about that. Here's what Hansen said in that testimony. Our climate model simulations for the late 1980s and the 1990s indicate a tendency for an increase of heat wave drought conditions in the southeast and Midwest United States. So here's the NOAA graph for Midwest precipitation since 1988. It was very dry back then, but since then almost every single year has been above normal precipitation, and it's getting wetter in the Midwest. So Hansen got that prediction exactly backwards. Hansen was dead wrong with his forecasts about drought. Now let's look at his forecast for temperature. Here's what he said. The number of days per year in which the maximum daily temperature exceeds 100 degrees increased from about 1 in 1988 to 12 in Washington and from 3 to 20 in Omaha. The number of days with maximum temperature exceeding 90 degrees increases from about 35 days in 1988 to 85 days in the future in both cities. So Hansen is forecasting a huge increase in the number of 90-degree and 100-degree temperature days. Well, this is easy enough to check out. Let's take a look at how he did. Ashland, Nebraska is the closest United States Historical Climatology Network station to Omaha, and the number of 90-degree days there has plummeted since the 19th century. In fact, it's nearly dropped in half. Wow, Hansen got that prediction wrong. Similarly, the number of 100-degree days at Omaha has also plummeted. It's gone way down since the 1930s, and in the last few years they haven't had any 100-degree temperature days at all. Hansen completely messed up that forecast. Same story at Washington, D.C. The number of 90-degree days was very high in 1988. They had 53 of them, but they've gone way down since then. So Hansen missed about 90-degree days in the Washington, D.C. area. And the same thing with 100-degree days. They peaked in 1988 when Hansen gave his testimony, but they've gone way down since then. Hansen was completely wrong about Washington, D.C. too. Now let's look at some of Hansen's other forecasts. On the 20th anniversary of his testimony before Congress, which was 10 years ago, Hansen said, "We're toast." Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Well, it's 10 years now. Representative Ed Markey, Democrat Massachusetts Committee Chairman, said, "Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet." Well, let's see how the Democrats' climate prophet did. It's been 10 years. The Arctic should be free of ice now. These maps from the Danish Meteorological Institute show sea ice thickness on June 22nd this year and June 22nd, 2008, when Hansen made that forecast that we'd be ice-free now. Well, you can see what happened. There's lots of thick sea ice now all around the Arctic. This red represents ice more than 4 meters thick. But 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of thick ice. In fact, the ice was so thin near the North Pole that summer that many top climate experts predicted the North Pole was going to be ice-free that summer. Well, Hansen was wrong, and they were wrong too. Instead of getting thinner and disappearing, the ice has gotten much thicker over the last decade. In fact, data from the Danish Meteorological Institute shows us that Arctic sea ice volume is the highest it's been since 2005. It's not disappearing. The ice is getting thicker. Hansen totally messed up that forecast. Let's look at some of his other ones. June 24th, 1988. Heat would cause inland waters to evaporate more rapidly, thus lowering the level of bodies of water such as the Great Lakes. The global warming signal had arrived, Hansen said. So Hansen said the Great Lakes were going to dry up. Let's see how that forecast did. Well, data from NOAA shows us that the Great Lakes water levels have increased substantially and are now close to record highs. Once again, Hansen completely got his forecast backwards, like with all of his other ones. Here's another James Hansen forecast from 1988. He predicted that within 30 years, i.e. this year, Lower Manhattan would be underwater. Salon Magazine. Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect for Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, if what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? Hansen said, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. You'll have signs in restaurants saying water by request only. When did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years. And remember, we had this conversation in 1988. Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. So in 1988, he predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years. Well, that's now. Well, here's a webcam image from this week from Lower Manhattan, the West Side Highway. Doesn't look like it's underwater to me. In fact, tide gauge data from NOAA at Lower Manhattan shows that sea level there is about exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. Well, Hansen completely messed up that forecast. So I've been showing you how Hansen made all these very specific predictions and got them all wrong. He basically messed everything up. So what do climate scientists say about it now? On 30th anniversary of James Hansen's landmark global warming congressional testimony, scientists agree he got it right. Hansen got it right, said scientist Stefan Rahmstorf of the Potsdam Institute in Germany. Amazing, remarkably prescient. And here's what the New York Times says. James Hansen wishes he wasn't so right about global warming. James Hansen wishes he was wrong. He wasn't. NASA's top climate scientist in 1988, Hansen warned the world about all kinds of horrible things, and he was right. Hansen won't say, I told you so. I don't want to be right in that sense, Hansen told the Associated Press in an interview in his New York penthouse apartment. That's because being right means the world is warming at an unprecedented pace, and ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland are melting. If those ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland melt, we're all going to drown. But wait a minute, the government says that Greenland gained ice last year. In this year's data, the blue line shows that Greenland is still gaining ice in summer, and it's way above normal. So last year Greenland gained ice, and this year Greenland gaining ice again. But Hansen says it's melting down, and we're going to drown. And what about Antarctica? Well, NASA says that Antarctica is also gaining ice. So NOAA says that Greenland's gaining ice, and NASA says that Antarctica is gaining ice. That sure doesn't sound like a meltdown to me. Hansen got everything exactly backwards, and he's toasted by climate scientists in the press as being a prophet and being right about everything. Because in climate science, everything is like Alice down the rabbit hole. Talking to climate scientists and climate journalists is like talking to the Mad Hatter. Whatever they say is normally the exact opposite of reality. So what's this all about? Well, United Nations climate official Ottmar Edenhofer explained. He said, one has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with the environment anymore. We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy, said Edenhofer. So Edenhofer spilled the beans. Facts and data don't matter in climate science. It's all about redistributing the world's wealth, and it's all about controlling energy policy. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling
Hi, everybody.
back
Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio.
science
I
for a
hope
long
you're doing
time.
well. Here, you can see
Al Gore, bring this up, Jordan. Al Gore is going to create an Inconvenient Truth sequel. So he's pretty happy about that. He's going to be creating the Inconvenient Truth sequel. And a British High Court ruled, this is not a right-wing conspiracy, anti-science conspiracy. A British High Court ruled that there were 9 significant factual errors in an Inconvenient Truth. But they still allowed it in schools. So they're saying there's 9 significant errors, But we're still going to allow this to be shown in schools. With Al Gore, I'm sure you just must have jumped out of your seat when you heard that he was doing an Inconvenient Truth 2. Did you not know about this?
Well, you know what's extraordinary, Stephen, is I'm just amazed he's alive, by the way. Because what's quite amazing is that because he said that we would be all dead by now. So I just think we should take a moment and celebrate the fact that we're even here, Stephen, because, a lot of people said we'd be dead. Now, obviously, they've been saying we're going to die for a really long time. But Al Gore said it, and you just like Al Gore. He was on a cherry picker. He was telling us stuff, and anyway, we're here, Stephen. So a lot to celebrate. I'm not sure what his film's going to be about because everything he said was basically wrong. Here's the story with the polar bears, Stephen.
Yeah.
Here's the story.
Got it.
They're smoking, and they're really fat, and they're hanging out in huge numbers, in record-breaking numbers, a 40-year high in the population of polar bears. They're smoking, they're hanging out. It's a really good time for polar bears.
Yeah.
If anything, they're just getting very, very fat because life is good and life is lovely for the polar bears. I'm really curious to see this new movie of Al Gore's because I'm wondering, is he going to just drop his polar bears? Because obviously the polar bears have let Al Gore down and we're all disappointed about that. Yeah. But the polar bears had not. I've spoken to
which is sad for them because they took him
today,
in as one of their own. He lived with them.
Have not heard the news about their own extinction. John Holdren said that by 2020, 1 billion people would be dead because basically of our use of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
When do they, that thing of love is never having to say you're sorry.
Right.
When do they say they're sorry? Like, when do they say they're sorry?
Yeah.
And Al Gore said 10 years ago, if we didn't take drastic steps to change our behavior, we would reach the... And I wish we had music for this, Stephen.
Hold on.
The point of no return. The point of no return, Stephen. We have already reached the point of no return. So we should just, burn all the fossil fuels we like. Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister, not an idiot, well, let's maybe debate that.
It's up for debate.
Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, in 2009 said, we had 50 days left to save the planet. Prince Charles, bless his heart. Ugh. Prince Charles, who we have the very funny video about him, Prince Charles Hypocrite, said in 2009 we had 96 months left to save the planet. Rajendra Pakuchri, whose name I'm sure I'm butchering, the head of the IPCC, said in 2007 we had 4 years to save the planet. I don't know, maybe these guys should get together and come up with some kind of consensus on when it is that we're all about to die. George Monbiot, who we really do love, from The Guardian, said in 2002 that in 10 years, the world would have to choose between feeding the animals on the planet or feeding the people, but we couldn't have both.
Well, let's just feed the people with the animals. That doesn't even seem like a riddle.
I think it's extraordinary, how easy it is for elites who have the life that Al Gore has, the beautiful life that he has, flying around in planes and having lovely dinners and being warm in his lovely house and in other houses and using loads and loads of fossil fuels and being really wealthy. And that he would impose on the poor of the world an alternative to fossil fuels, when fossil fuels have worked out so well for all of us and we're living these very safe lives, by the way. We have our children, if they get sick, going to hospitals where we're not relying on the wind blowing or the sun shining for the electricity to be on. But he's imposing that kind of that awful, unreliable energy on the developing world. And I just think as you say, there's a really tragic side to this. It isn't funny at all.
We have a preview now for 10 years later, An Inconvenient Truth 2. Al Gore seems excited about it.
A decade ago, I released my Academy Award-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. It was met with great applause, fanfare, and cold hard cash. But to my dismay and everlasting shame, a British High Court ruled that many of my facts were unfounded and outright misleading, legally obligating me to produce this sequel. I found out that the ice caps were not melting, but in many parts of the world gaining more ice than they were losing, and that polar bears are in fact not endangered, but alive and well. Also, they're kind of assholes. I was extremely surprised to find out that sea levels were not actually rising so fast as to threaten all the coastal cities I'd warned about, allowing me to stay in my beachfront mansion. Also, I still sit on the board of Apple. And finally, I learned that carbon dioxide is necessarily not in fact a pollutant, but a byproduct of the planet's natural cycle, necessary for all living beings.
Mr. Gorin, it's time for your massaging.
Now, Sven, hold up. I'm just finishing my movie trailer narration.
But Mr. Gorin, I'm already in the cosplay outfitting.
An Inconvenient Truth 2 in theaters 2017. Okay, Sven, but this time no slippers. I want those little piggies to get wild and woolly.
Hey, if you like this video, subscribe by clicking the button that says subscribe. If you're not aware of it now, there's no way you're learning the internet at this point. I'm not going to help you. But this was clipped from my daily show, available exclusively to louderwithcrowder.com/mugclub members. If you're student, military, or veteran, enter in that promo code. It's less than $6 a month, and you get daily content. No more clips, plus this hand-etched mug. Oh, when I feel it, I got a chill like on the inside.
Well, that's a big subject, of course, and I mean, I don't like the word catastrophe. I don't think there's any catastrophe there. But certainly the climate is changing, and that's important. It's always been changing. There's never been a time when the climate stayed put for any length of time, and so I would say all the evidence we have is that we're having some effect on the climate. It's not clear whether it's good or bad. It's not clear whether it's going to become a catastrophe or not. And so as far as I'm concerned, it's very foolish to do anything spectacular. What we should be doing is dealing with the problems in detail. I mean, the first thing is we should build dikes around New Orleans. And I mean, there are simple practical things we can do which really would help. And like building dikes around cities which are exposed to hurricanes or tsunamis. And so these kind of practical measures could be enormously helpful. I mean, we've seen just in the last few months, we've seen two big earthquakes, one in Haiti and one in Chile, and what we've seen is that the earthquake in Chile was much larger, but the damage actually was smaller. The reason being that Chileans had taken more trouble to build buildings that would resist earthquakes, and so it actually helps enormously to strengthen your buildings. Of course, Chile has the advantage of being a richer country to start with, but it's a dramatic proof of what you can do. You can actually take a natural catastrophe and reduce the damage by a factor of 100 or so, just by quite simple measures, just having good building codes. And the same is true of climate, that there are all sorts of things we can do in a practical way. It's not only we don't only have to worry about warming, we also have to worry about cooling, and it could very well be the climate gets colder. Nobody knows. And there are many things we should be doing to prepare for that, and which are not all that expensive. But what I think is absurd, what I disagree with very strongly, is the idea that climate is predictable, that we can do things 100 years in advance knowing what's going to happen. That's just not the way it is.
In 1971, I helped found an environmental group in the basement of a Unitarian church in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years later, it had grown into an international powerhouse. We were making headlines every month. I was famous, and then I walked out the door. The mission, once noble, had become corrupted. Political agendas and fear-mongering trumped science and truth. Here's how it happened. When I was studying for my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, I joined a small activist group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. It was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. I became radicalized by these realities and by the emerging consciousness of the environment. The mission of the Don't Make a Wave Committee was to launch an ocean-going campaign against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, a symbol of our opposition to nuclear war. As one of our early meetings was breaking up, someone said, "Peace." A reply came, "Why don't we make it a green peace?" And a new movement was born. Green was for the environment, and peace was for the people. We named our boat the Greenpeace, and I joined the 12-person crew for a voyage of protest. We didn't stop that H-bomb test, but it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. We had won a major victory. In 1975, Greenpeace took a sharp turn away from our anti-nuclear efforts and set out to save the whales, sailing the high seas to confront Russian and Japanese whalers. The footage we shot, young protesters positioned between harpoons and fleeing whales, was shown on TV around the world. Public donations poured in. By the early 1980s, we were campaigning against toxic waste, air pollution, trophy hunting, and the live capture of orca whales. But I began to feel uncomfortable with the course my fellow directors were taking. I found myself the only one of 6 international directors with a formal science background. We were now tackling subjects that involved complex issues of toxicology, chemistry, and human health. You don't need a PhD in marine biology to know it's a good thing to save whales from extinction. But when you're analyzing which chemicals to ban, you need to know some science. And the first lesson of ecology is that we are all interconnected. Humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Many other species, disease agents and their carriers, for example, are our enemies, and we have the moral obligation to protect human beings from these enemies. Biodiversity is not always our friend. I had noticed something else. As we grew into an international organization with over 100 million a year coming in, a big change in attitude had occurred. The peace in Greenpeace had faded away. Only the green part seemed to matter now. Humans, to use Greenpeace language, had become the enemies of the earth. Putting an end to industrial growth and banning many useful technologies and chemicals became common themes of the movement. Science and logic no longer held sway. Sensationalism, misinformation, and fear were what we used to promote our campaigns. The final straw came when my fellow directors decided that we had to work to ban the element chlorine worldwide. They named chlorine the devil's element, as if it were evil. But this was absurd. Adding chlorine to drinking water was one of the biggest advances in the history of public health. And anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry knew that many of our most effective pharmaceuticals had a chlorine component. Not only that, but if this anti-chlorine campaign succeeded, it wouldn't be our wealthy donors who would suffer. Wealthy individuals and countries always find a way around these follies. The ones who suffer are those in developing countries, people we're presumably trying to help. For example, Greenpeace has opposed the adoption of golden rice, a genetically modified variety of rice that contains beta-carotene. Golden rice has the potential to prevent the death of 2 million of the world's poorest children every year. But that doesn't matter to the Greenpeace crowd. GMOs are bad, so golden rice must be bad. Apparently millions of children dying isn't. This kind of rigid backward thinking is usually attributed to the unenlightened and the anti-scientific. But I've discovered from the inside out that it can infect any organization, even those with names as noble-sounding as Greenpeace. I'm Patrick Moore for Prager University.
Join Prager University. Click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click here to sign up for free at prageru.com for quizzes, contests, and prizes.
Practice what you preach. It's an admonition that we've all heard sometime in our lives when we're acting like hypocrites. It makes me wonder if Al Gore's parents ever scolded him for preaching one thing while doing another. This question came to mind after the release of Gore's follow-up to An Inconvenient Truth. You see, after the original movie came out in 2006, Gore was lambasted for being a hypocrite. While Gore was predicting climate doom because we are all using too much energy, his own electric bills proved he was burning 20 times more electricity than the average American household. There's nothing more destructive to a crusader's cause than hypocrisy, so Gore jumped into action. He put 33 280-watt solar panels on his roof and, among other improvements, installed geothermal. It seemed he was serious because he spent $250,000 on the renovation. Well, that's the way it seemed anyway. To coincide with the release of Gore's sequel, the National Center for Public Policy Research conducted a new study to see if Gore had stopped being a hypocrite. Guess what? 10 years later, Al Gore is an even bigger energy hog. Gore is burning up not 20, but 34 times the electricity than the national average. The National Center discovered that from August 2016 through July 2017, Gore spent almost, get this, $22,000 on electricity bills for his posh Nashville home. Gore uses so much electricity, all those solar panels provide less than 6% of his power consumption. And by the way, Gore owns at least 2 other large homes, and they were not included in this analysis. Some folks want to give Gore a pass because his home is huge, more than 10,000 square feet. But that argument doesn't hold up. Efficient homes use between 5 and 10 kilowatt hours of electricity per square foot each year, no matter how large or small. Gore's home uses 23. Doesn't it make you wonder what the heck is going on in there? Gore divorced his wife Tipper several years back, and she lives in her own mansion in California. And Gore travels a lot, so the home is presumably empty a good percentage of the time. What's got that electric meter running so hard? Well, it's great fun pointing out Gore's astonishing hypocrisy. There's a more important point to be made here. Gore had to know his electricity bills would be scrutinized when the new film came out. Yet, he became an even bigger energy hog. What the former vice president's actions tell us is that it's more important for him to live the life of an energy-guzzling fat cat than it is to be a crusader who lives modestly so he actually has some credibility. Finally, and this is the most important fact of all, when Al Gore's term as vice president ended, he was worth about $2 million. He then focused all his attention on becoming the world's chief climate change alarmist. It was an extremely lucrative career move. He's now estimated to be worth $300 million. So ask yourself, what's driving Al Gore? Is it really a sincere concern for the planet? Or is sounding the alarm about climate change a great way to get rich? Power on, America.
I pledge to take personal action to help solve the climate crisis by reducing my own CO2 pollution as much as I can.
Climate change is real. It is happening right now. It is the most urgent threat facing our entire species, and we need to work collectively together and stop procrastinating.
I pledge to work for a dramatic increase in the energy efficiency of my home, workplace, school, place of worship, and means of transportation.
Worse, it has the potential to make our planet unlivable. The solutions we seek require all of us to make real changes in the way we live our lives, operate our businesses, and govern our communities.
What can you do? Reduce emissions in your home, where you can. I mentioned automobiles. Buy a hybrid. Use light rail. Figure out some of the other options that are much better. It's important. Be a green consumer. Consider this. Make a decision to live a carbon neutral life.
Even cutting the amount of beef that you eat in half or by a quarter could make a significant difference.
Very significant. It's such an urgent threat that DiCaprio took 6 round-trip private jet flights in just 6 weeks between April and May 2014.
DiCaprio, who is believed to own at least 4 homes, reportedly taking at least 20 trips across America and around the world this year alone, usually on private jets, which use a lot of fuel.
He also took a private jet from LA to Las Vegas and stayed in Vegas for just 8 hours to attend a party before flying all the way back again.
DiCaprio says Trump's move threatens, quote, the livability of our planet, and yet DiCaprio flew a private jet 4,000 miles from Cannes, France to New York to accept a climate award and then flew back.
Well, and get this summer, DiCaprio spending time on the 5th largest yacht in the world, a big boat, which, you know, rented from a Middle East oil tycoon. Talk about a carbon footprint.
What do you say to critics who say you go on yachts, you're traveling, and then here you are trying to get climate change?
Got to get the climate march moving. Sorry. Somebody like Al Gore, who makes a lot of money on it and then whips around a private jet and has all this air conditioning in his mansion.
Houses.
That, everybody knows he's a hypocrite.
Right.
All right, everybody knows that's wrong.
He owns a home in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. He owns 2 properties in California, a condo overlooking San Francisco Bay, and an ocean view villa in Montecito. Then there's the house and farm in Carthage, Tennessee. Then, of course, there's his mansion in Nashville. Oh, and the humongous houseboat he keeps on a lake in Tennessee. He calls it BioSolar One.
So that means while Al Gore was flying his private plane from Nashville to California, the average American family could have loaded the kids and the family dog in a car and driven from Nashville to California and back more than 15 times. That's 15 times to equal the vice president's carbon footprint, and that's only one way.
Let's talk about global warming, then I want to get to the snowflakes.
Okay.
We were on stage, and a woman got up and asked you a question about global warming, and you went on to explain why you don't believe in it. You said you changed your, you said you got some new evidence recently.
Yeah.
What happened that night?
Okay.
Why did that clip go viral?
The lady said, I have children and you got a few bucks and don't you want, I want to leave the world a better place for my kids, essentially what she was saying.
Which is a good question.
Yeah, it's fine. It's
Do
fair
you?
enough. Yeah, I like my children. I want my children very much, but I realize it's up to them. It's not up to me. See,
You're one of the biggest force multipliers in the world.
Yeah, but
they don't have a following.
but it's up to the individual. I can give you all the information, but if you don't pull the trigger and take action. So getting back to the lady, and I said, and I went through my story, which is not a story. Sally and I are in the South Pole, 2011, and we're there, and there's a big $500 million scientific station there that's mostly funded by the U.S. government. And the scientists came over and gave us presentations, and they had drilled 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 cores in the South Pole. Not many people realize the South Pole is on a mountaintop, so you're up about 12, 13, 14,000 feet. So a lot of people suffer from oxygen deprivation. Didn't bother Sally and I. And so he's going through these cores, and then he says in 55,000 years ago, it was 1.96 degrees warmer Celsius than today. And stop. Let's go back to that. How do you know that? And then all these MIT, Caltech, all these guys, because of this, E equals bullshit. We know for absolutely within a millionth of a percent, it was warmer.
But no one's denying that.
No, wait. Okay. And we all know it's cyclical.
Yeah, we know it's cyclical.
Okay, and then what about global warming? Everybody laughs all at the same time. It's a load of shit. I mean, we could have predicted this global warming 100 years before, but nobody did because nobody figured out a way to make any money out of it.
Okay, but when people talk about global warming, they're talking about the human being accelerated version of the warming. No one's saying that it's not cyclical.
No. They say it has nothing to do with the hairspray, the ozone, nothing. Zero. In fact, if you read Scientific American like the good MIT guy you are, you would have known 3 months ago they said for the first time in 40 years, the ozone, is thickened up again.
Yeah, the ozone has, but that's a little different than carbon dioxide emissions.
They also said that we've known for at least 50, 60, 70 years that every square meter on the ground, on the planet, has between 10 and 15,000 times more energy from the sun than is needed. 10 to 15,000. How does it vary? You're closer to the sun, it's 15,000. Farther from the sun, 10,000.
Okay. What does that mean?
Now,
there's tons of energy on this
Tons
planet.
and tons and tons. Okay. The first electric car was in 1846, I believe. I know. 1846. Do you think if we really wanted fucking electric cars, we couldn't have them? It was 35 or 40 years before gasoline cars. But now, since then, and then of course, Sally and I went to the North Pole.
Okay. The electric car thing is because of the oil business and all that, right?
Correct. I'll get back to that.
We'll get back to that.
So then we go to the North Pole, and now there's Russian scientists. Hardly anybody spoke English, okay? And we got remarried at the North Pole, and we talked to the scientists, and same questions, same answers as we got from the South Pole. And global warming, they all laughed, drinking vodka. Everybody's drinking when on the North Pole, the Russians. And Russians do like to drink vodka, as they say. And they were saying, yeah, it's just a load of shit. Everybody knows it's a load of shit, and we've known it for years. When I was in the energy business, and forevermore I'm be an oil man, okay?
You are an oil man.
Well, an oil man. Everybody knew that when people will take more seriously global warming is when Aramco, Saudi, the kingdom, runs out of oil. Now, 2 years ago, Aramco, which is the petroleum company of the Saudi government, announced they're going to go public. This was when oil was $28 a barrel. Now, why would smart guys, MIT kind of guys, say they're going to go public at the lowest oil price in the last 30, 40 years? Why?
Why?
Because when you go public, and they're going to sell 2% of the company off. When they go public, they have to publish a reserve report, which means that for the first time in the history since they discovered oil there, J. Paul Getty discovered oil there back 70, 80 years ago, they're going to know about plus or minus 10% how much oil the Saudis really have. Now, I'm here to tell you, they have hundreds of trillions of barrels. They're never going to run out of fucking oil in your children's lifetime. Now, they've now pulled back and they've changed 3 times the date of the public offering. 3 times in the last 2 years. Now, 2019 looks good, but maybe not. We'll let the market dictate. Of course, oil is up from $25, $26 a barrel up to 65-ish, more or less. They don't want to publish that number if they don't have to. The price, I hear, where the lines cross, supply and demand for Aramco, for the kingdom, is around $75 to $80 a barrel. Stabilized over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, not one day. Okay, so I don't see, one, they're going to go public, Because if they do, they're going to have to tell what the reserves are. And you know what the price of oil is going to do when they say that there's 42 gazillion barrels of oil?
It's going to drop.
Like a fucking stone.
And so what does this have to do with the global warming?
No, because global warming is an anomaly based on hyped up by this generation for something to bitch about. We've had it. We had it 55,000 years ago. We had it 300,000 years ago. But to blame it on us is bullshit.
Isn't it not accelerated by humans and carbon emissions?
100 millionth of a percent.
Okay.
Who cares?
So this is just a scam and a sham and all this.
I'm jealous of Vice President, what's his face?
Gore.
Gore. I'm jealous. And Sally and I were on a plane with him. A few years ago, he got in trouble because of the footprint, you know, the big G3 he flies around, or G5, I guess it is. And so he was flying commercial. We were coming back from Peru, Lima. And Sally and I were down there on some safari. And I noticed, God, well, why are these guys with fucking suits in here? Business class, they had no first class. And so it's Vice President Gore. He stands up and and he's not as tall, you know, all these people that say they're 6'3", I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, he's about your height. And, you know,
everyone says
only 6'1". He's only 6'1". He's about...
everyone says I'm as tall as you.
Yeah.
How tall are you?
I'm 6'1".
Okay. I'm not 6'1".
No.
Oh.
Okay. And
does Gore believe in climate change, or is it all made up?
I don't know. I can't speak for the former vice president. But he's got to know the same stats I know. Now, since then, since the thing went viral because of your movie premiere, I had my crack staff do some research. And then I double-checked the research. I found one error. And you know how many people have been to the North and South Pole? Both since the beginning of motherfucking time, recorded time.
Couple hundred? Just you and Sally?
No.
How many?
Not counting the teams, but the lead people, 10 people, plus Sally and I. 12. Since the beginning of fucking time. You know how many of those other 10 are bitching about global warming? 0. I can't wait. I was supposed to be on a panel at George Mason University last March. First it was going to be a talk. I could talk about anything, and then it wasn't. Then it was a panel, and then they wouldn't let me film it, so then I dropped out. But I was hoping global warming would come up.
And so you're saying because you were at the South and you were at the North, I mean, it doesn't make you an expert. But
No, but I talked to the experts.
Okay, and none of them buy it.
These journalists, these fucking journalists that are writing about this, they haven't talked to Dick. They haven't talked to anybody. Nobody's asked me what I saw there. Nobody's asked me the scientists that I met with. Yeah, 10 plus Sally and I. And Sally and I are bipolar.
Let's talk about climate models. Specifically, let's talk about the climate models that attempt to predict the future temperature of the planet. But before we do, it's important that you know a little bit about me. I'm a physicist. I taught at Columbia University and then at Princeton for 5 decades. I've published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers. I have co-authored several books, including one of the first on how carbon dioxide emissions, CO2, affects the climate. I served as the director of the Office of Energy Research at the U.S. Department of Energy. And before that, I invented the sodium guide star, which is still used on most big astronomical telescopes to measure and correct for atmospheric turbulence. That is, for the unpredictable movement of air and water. This turbulence blurs the images of stars and other space objects. One more thing. I care deeply about the environment. We live on a beautiful planet. I want to keep it that way. I've spent a lot of time working to do just that. In short, I know a lot about the Earth's atmosphere and climate. I also know a lot about long-term predictive climate models. And I know they don't work. They haven't worked in the past. They don't work now. And it's hard to imagine when, if ever, they'll work in the foreseeable future. There's a common sense reason for this. Aside from the human brain, the climate is the most complex thing on the planet. The number of factors that influence climate, the sun, the Earth's orbital properties, oceans, clouds, and yes, industrial man, is huge and enormously variable. Let me try to narrow this down. For the purposes of illustration, let's just focus our attention on water. The Earth is essentially a water planet. A major aspect of climate involves the complicated interaction between two very turbulent fluids, the atmosphere, which holds large amounts of water, think rain and snow, and the oceans, which cover fully 70% of the Earth's surface. We can't predict what effect the atmosphere is going to have on future temperatures because we can't predict cloud formations and the convection of heat, oxygen, salt, and other quantities that pass through the oceans, not to mention weather cycles like El Nino in the tropical Pacific, make predicting ocean temperatures an equally difficult business. We can't predict either side of the atmosphere-ocean equation, but we can say this with certainty. Water in all its phases has huge effects on atmospheric heating and cooling. Compared to water, H2O, carbon dioxide, CO2, is a minor contributor to the warming of the Earth. It's devilishly difficult to predict what a fluid will do. Trying to figure out what two fluids will do in interaction with each other on a planetary scale over long periods of time is close to impossible. Anyone who followed the forecast of Hurricane Irma's path in the late summer of 2017 should understand this. First, the models predicted a direct hit on Miami and the east coast of Florida. Then, defying these predictions, the hurricane suddenly veered to the west coast of Florida. In other words, even with massive amounts of real-time data, the models still could not accurately predict Irma's path 2 days in advance. Does any rational person believe that computer models can precisely predict temperatures decades from now? The answer is they can't. That's why over the last 30 years, one climate prediction after another based on computer models has been wrong. They're wrong because even the most powerful computers can't solve all the equations needed to accurately describe climate. Instead of admitting this, some climate scientists replace the highly complex equations that describe the real-world climate with highly simplified ones. They're computer models. Discarding the unmanageable details, modelers tune their simplified equations with lots of adjustable inputs, numbers that can be changed to produce whatever result the modelers want. So if they want to show that the Earth's temperature at the end of the century will be 2 degrees centigrade higher than it is now, they put in the numbers that produce that result. That's not science. That's science fiction. I'm Will Happer, Emeritus Professor of Physics at Princeton University for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
As you know, one of the biggest arguments against us is there's a consensus. As though this was some kind of an argument. Can we all practice that? There's a consensus. Now, Aristotle, 2,350 years ago, some of you are old enough to remember, actually said that argument from consensus was a species of feeble-mindedness known as a logical fallacy, one of the commonest logical fallacies in human discourse. But the fact is that there may be a consensus, and we're going to check that now by doing an experiment, and Diane is going to help with this. And I'm going to ask you half a dozen questions. Here is the first question, and Diane is going to read it out to you.
Does climate change?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that climate changes. Diane is going to tell me how many people don't think climate changes.
No hands.
So we have, ladies and gentlemen, 100% consensus that climate changes. Cook et al. 2013, eat your hearts out. Now then, read this one out too, number 2.
Has the atmospheric concentration of CO2 increased since the late 1950s?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that the concentration of CO2 has gone up since the 1950s. Diane, how many hands?
No hands whatsoever.
Another 100% consensus. Go on to question 3.
Is man likely to have contributed to the measured increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration since the late 1950s?
Hands up all those who disagree with that proposition.
No hands.
No hands. Number 4.
Other things being equal, is it likely that adding CO2 to the atmosphere will cause some global warming?
Anybody disagree with that? No. No hands again.
No hands.
Number 5.
Is it likely that there has been some global warming since the late 1950s?
Anybody disagree that there's been warming since the late 50s?
No
Once
hands.
Again,
no
hands.
hands.
Very good.
Is it likely? Good. Is it likely that man's emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have contributed to the measured global warming since 1950?
Anyone disagree with that? Once again, no hands. Now, you may say, why have I bothered to ask these actually fairly crass questions, which are an insult to your intelligence? That is because we are all too frequently accused of not accepting any of those points. And I wanted it to be made absolutely plain to those who are watching this from afar that we are not climate change deniers. We do not deny that climate changes. We do not deny that CO2 is increasing or that we are somehow responsible for some of that. We don't deny, therefore, that we could be causing some global warming. So get that clear. Climate skeptics are not skeptical of the things we're accused of being skeptical of. But look at the results of this survey of 11,944 papers in the scientific literature published between 1991 and 2011, a period of 21 years. They said that 97% agreed that humans are causing global warming. In fact, they say we are the cause. We would say, the only difference is we would say we are a cause. But we have 100% consensus. Now, what I want to do is to have a little closer look at this particular survey. I've nearly finished with you, so don't worry, you're doing very well. Isn't you doing well, ladies and gentlemen? She had no prior notice of this, and I think you've stood up very well under this onslaught. Now, on the slide that you see there now, you will see 3 separate definitions of consensus. The first one, that humans can be causing some warming, is the definition of consensus that all of us agree with. We have 100% consensus, they only have 97%. Now, the next definition of consensus is that most of the recent global warming since roughly 1950 was caused by us. Now, on that, I suspect there would be much less unanimity in this room because we do not know what fraction of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. And yet, when Cook et al. Reported their results, they said that they had found a 97% consensus to the effect that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. That was their definition of consensus. It is the same as the IPCC's definition of consensus. It's the official definition of the climate consensus, that we are responsible for most of the warming since 1950. Now, I'm not going to ask you your views on that, because as good scientists, you don't have one. It might or might not be true. But let us therefore look at how they managed to present what is actually a 0.3% consensus in the reviewed literature on that question as a 97.1% consensus. The first thing is they eliminated 2/3 of all the papers they were looking at on the grounds that they hadn't expressed an opinion. Now, that is not normally how these surveys are done, but that's what they did. They knocked those out. Then they congregated together 3 levels of endorsement, only one of which was the majoritarian endorsement that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They lumped that with the explicit or implicit endorsement of the consensus that we all agree with, that maybe we have contributed some warming and we don't know how much. They put all those together, and by conflating these 2 completely different definitions of consensus, they claimed there was this consensus of 97.1% that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They said so in their paper, and they said so in a subsequent paper commenting on their paper. And it was only when my good friends David Lee Gates, Willie Soon, and Matt Briggs and I got together, did the math, and published a paper in Science and Education showing what the true figure was, that the truth began to emerge.
So it comes from a study by an Australian whose name is John Cook. As in Cook the data. Is the right, so this was the Antifa fellow. The self-proclaimed Antifa militant killed Saturday by Washington State Police as he attacked a local Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention center was seen in a recent CNN program that critics say glorified a radical left-wing movement. So yeah, CNN was out there massaging these guys, let's say, feet and telling them what wonderful anti-Nazi heroes they were. And this guy, Willem von Vance Bronson, sent a manifesto to friends, as I said, the day before the assault, in which he wrote, "I am Antifa." Now, of course, he's a martyr to the cause and all this kind of stuff. He appears to have been part of a May 5th episode of CNN's United Shades of America with W. Kamau Bell. The heavily promoted CNN show featured Bell explaining the Redneck Revolt, which he identified as gun-toting liberals who defend the Second Amendment and seek to battle the alt-right and neo-Nazis. Apparently neo-Nazis for this guy includes, I guess, mostly Hispanics guarding and in these detention centers. So Bell, right, this is the guy, I don't know, man or woman, W. Kamau Bell. Bell called them, right, these Antifa guys, called them good guys. Let's zoom in there just to enjoy that, right? He called them good guys, going to a gun range with members and even questioning why more white people don't share their viewpoints. So this domestic terrorist, Antifa fellow, who seems to have done death by cop by going to attack this detention center, trying to set fire to a building with people inside. Could have been dozens or even more people murdered or killed. Well, he's according to CNN, this guy is part of the group called the Good Guys, right? One of the men featured on the CNN special appears to be Vance Bronson, who was armed with a rifle and incendiary device when he launched his assault on a Northwest detention center in Tacoma around 4 a.m. Saturday, according to the Tacoma Police Department. Right, so this is what I mentioned yesterday. He was throwing incendiary devices, setting vehicles on fire. He was carrying flares. He was trying to ignite a propane tank when he was confronted by the officers who opened fire. He died of multiple gunshot wounds. So this guy, right, so CNN did not respond to a request for comment and request to confirm that Vance Bronson was featured on the network, but you can look it up and you can see it, right? Bell noted that the Redneck Revolt, quote, protects counter-protesters, feeds the hungry, and provides gun safety courses. Bell also organized an on-camera meeting between the Redneck Revolt and Black Lives Matter. Vance Bronson appears to be one of the attendees. The CNN host laughed and
Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter é uma organização terrorista baseada numa mentira. Depois podem ver isso. É uma organização terrorista que é inspirada numa mentira da mainstream media.
And nodded his head in agreement throughout the meeting. So, Media Research Center Vice President Dan Gaynor told Fox News, CNN has done more to give the psycho-domestic terrorists of Antifa credibility than any other outlet. Now, Antifa has escalated from attacking people in the street to sending a journalist to the hospital with a brain hemorrhage to finally a deadly attack of domestic terrorism. So he's referring, of course, to journalist Antti Ngo, who was attacked by Antifa during a protest in Portland last month. And it was this journalist who first noticed that Vance Bronson appeared to be recently glorified by CNN. So this is, he says, this is from Andy. CNN recently aired a documentary about the Antifa militia whose member was killed in an ICE firebombing attack yesterday. You can see Mr. Van Spronson, I suppose to be, at the 4-second timestamping in this trailer. Quite something. So Andy wrote, CNN recently aired a documentary about the Antifa militia whose member was killed in an ICE firebombing attack yesterday. You can see Mr. Van Spronson at 4-second timestamp. While resurfacing a tweet that CNN's W. Kamau Bell sent promoting the special. Really quite something. CNN's official Twitter account also tweeted a preview of the show that appears to show Van Spronson. Amazing. It's going down, a website that bills itself as, quote, a digital community center for anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements, end quote, with a mission, quote, to provide a resilient platform to publicize.
Colonialismo foi a melhor coisa que aconteceu à África, aos países do Sub-Saara África, e foi a pior coisa que aconteceu aos países europeus, porque os países europeus investiram dinheiro, investiram primeiras colónias para plantar, para civilizar aquelas regiões, para depois no final perder tudo. Dinheiro pago com impostos dos portugueses, dos ingleses, dos holandeses, por aí adiante, e dos italianos, que depois, por saber, perderam completamente tudo, e ainda por cima agora têm que andar a receber os imigrantes. Mas aquelas zonas nem sequer eram habitadas, não se esqueçam disso. Moçambique, Angola, Guiné-Bissau não eram habitadas antes dos europeus chegarem lá. Não se esqueçam disso. Isso foi a melhor coisa que aconteceu à África. Perdemos dinheiro. Depois aquelas zonas que nós fomos os primeiros a habitar foram invadidas por invasores vindos do centro da Sub-Saara África, de países como regiões que agora são compostas por partes do Congo, partes da República do Congo e partes da República Central do Congo e Uganda, né? Aquele vídeo que eu fiz há pouco tempo. E depois no final perdemos tudo, não foi devolvido o dinheiro que nós investimos nesses países, milhões e milhões e milhões de euros em impostos, em vidas humanas, nos barcos e por aí adiante, não são baratas. Mas depois perdemos tudo, a construção das cidades que nós construímos lá. O nível de vida de Angola antes do fim da colonização de Angola, antes dos poderes terem as suas próprias terras, era bem melhor para toda a gente, inclusivamente para os pretos. A maior estação de comboios de Angola era melhor que a maior estação de Lisboa ou Porto. Era uma das maiores estações do mundo. A maior barragem do mundo foi construída pelos portugueses e dava energia a milhares e milhares e milhares de pretos.
And promote revolutionary theory in action, published a piece commenting on Vance Bronson following his death. And I quote, "We understand why Willem Vance Bronson decided to give his life to interrupt the violence that is perpetrated against undocumented people in the United States every day," the site wrote. Quote,
não são imigrantes não documentados, são imigrantes ilegais. Não são imigrantes não documentados. São imigrantes ilegais. Ok? Da mesma maneira que uma pessoa que rouba não é um possuidor não documentado de um objeto, não é? Não. São ladrões.
personal
Eu
responsibility.
disse que são imigrantes ilegais, são invasores.
And did what he could to put an end to what he recognized as injustice. What he did was heroic. CNN's United Shades of America episode that seemingly featured Vance Bronson also spent significant time promoting Antifa, and Bell even allowed a member to show off tie-dyed brass knuckles, a knife, and a face mask during what the CNN host called show and tell. Amazing. Others took to Twitter to point out that Vance Bronson's group was once apparently promoted on CNN. One user noted that Bell even asked his followers to, quote, support, end quote, the, quote, good work they are doing to actively end white supremacy. No comment, no comment, no comment. All right, so this is the producer of this.
Ninguém tem problema com white supremacy, não é? Ninguém tem problema com black supremacy que está constantemente presente na televisão, na rádio, no hip-hop, no rap, em filmes. Não é? Os presidentes de Angola, Moçambique, Zimbábue, África do Sul, Congo, são todos black supremacists e ninguém tem problema. Mas quando é white, já têm todos problemas. Quando é white supremacy, toda a gente tem problema. Quando é black supremacy, ninguém tem problema.
The black guy, right? Or the host, right? He says, as you are watching the hashtag United Shades episode about Puget Sound JBGC and the good work they are doing to actively end white supremacy, just understand that being on my show is bringing a lot more harassment their way. Do what you can to support them. Oh my God. Man alive, people operate in a different universe out there. I mean, people who criticize the left, it's such a tightrope. We have to be so careful about what we say, and the fear of even doing anything you can to remotely support any group that ends up nefarious is something you have to be very careful about. But these guys, do what you can to support them. They're doing good work, and then this guy ends up as a domestic terrorist. Imagine, I mean, again, I hate to repeat myself, but if you want to sit in this pilot's chair, feel free. But imagine what it would be like if I praised some group that then turned out to attack a mosque or attack an ICE detention center or something like that. I mean, good Lord. So the man who appears to be Vance Bronson is wearing a shirt during the CNN show that promotes the Puget Sound chapter of the John Brown Gun Club. So John Brown is the abolitionist from the 19th century, which is part of the Redneck Revolt. This is the specific group that Bell asked his followers to support. It's hardly the first time that CNN personalities have been accused of defending Antifa and its members. Back in April, CNN host Chris Cuomo, argued that Antifa's good cause was not equivalent to the positions espoused by neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Now, Cuomo said, you can talk about Antifa. I've watched them in streets protesting in different situations, okay? There are certainly aspects of them that are true to a cause that is a good cause. They want social justice. They want whatever they want in that context. CNN commentator Steve Cortez fired back, Chris, Antifa is not a good cause. CNN anchor clarified he did not want to espouse Antifa, but in 2018, Cuomo also argued that Antifa's violence against police was not equal to violence carried out by white supremacists and neo-Nazis.
Yep. Eu não me lembro de nenhum white supremacist a cometer violência contra ninguém. Nunca. É que nunca aconteceu mesmo. A não ser talvez um bocadinho de vandalismo, mas do resto. Violência mesmo, violência não. Porque queimar uma cruz no seu próprio quintal não é violência. A pessoa pode queimar o que quiser no seu quintal. Não é? E queimar uma cruz na relva do vizinho é ilegal e deve ser, mas é só vandalismo, não é homicídio, não é o que fizeram ao Andy no.
Well, there you have it, my friends. There you have it. It is perfectly fine to promote, to glorify, to ask for your listeners to support a group which seems to have in it a guy who just committed domestic terrorism against a government facility with incendiary devices, trying to blow up a propane tank, trying to set fire to cars, potentially causing who knows how many deaths, shot dead by the police. And that's fine. That's fine. Hey, quick question. Do you remember when Joe Biden kicked off his presidential campaign by praising Antifa? Do you remember Keith Ellison saying, I found something to strike heart Fear into the heart of Donald Trump holding up an Antifa handbook. They love these guys. These are the low-rent attack dogs of the left. And this guy shows up to commit a terrorist attack with a rifle. He's shot dead. Nobody's sitting there saying, well, how did this crazy guy get a hold of a gun? No, they love it. They love it when their side has the weaponry. You see, they love it when their side has the weaponry. They're not for gun control. They just want to disarm their opponents, want to disarm their enemies.
%, 97%, that is quite a bagful of consensus. Some other numbers.
The Skeptic's Case by Dr. David M.W. Evans. We check the main predictions of the climate models against the best and latest data. Every serious skeptical scientist has been consistently saying essentially the same thing for over 20 years, yet most people have never heard the message. Here it is, put simply enough for any lay reader willing to pay attention. What the government climate scientists say. The direct effect of CO2 is well-established physics, based on laboratory results and known for over a century. Feedbacks are due to the ways the Earth reacts to the direct warming effect of the CO2. The threefold amplification by feedbacks is based on the assumption, or guess, made around 1980 that more warming due to CO2 will cause more evaporation from the oceans, and that this extra water vapor will in turn lead to even more heat trapping because water vapor is the main greenhouse gas. And extra heat will cause even more evaporation, and so on. This amplification is built into all the climate models. The amount of amplification is estimated by assuming that nearly all the industrial age warming is due to our CO2. The government climate scientists and the media often tell us about the direct effect of the CO2, but rarely admit that 2/3 of their projected temperature increases are due to amplification by feedbacks. What the skeptics say. The serious skeptical scientists have always agreed with the government climate scientists about the direct effect of CO2. The argument is entirely about the feedbacks. The feedbacks dampen or reduce the direct effect of the extra CO2, cutting it roughly in half. The main feedbacks involve evaporation, water vapor, and clouds. In particular, water vapor condenses into clouds, so extra water vapor due to the direct warming effect of extra CO2 will cause extra clouds, which reflect sunlight back out into space and cool the Earth, thereby reducing the overall warming. There are, literally, thousands of feedbacks, each of which either reinforces or opposes the direct warming effect of the extra CO2. Almost every long-lived system is governed by net feedback that dampens its response to a perturbation. If a system instead reacts to a perturbation by amplifying it, the system is likely to reach a tipping point and become unstable, like the electronic squeal that erupts when a microphone gets too close to its speakers. The Earth's climate is long-lived and stable. It has never gone into runaway greenhouse, unlike Venus, which strongly suggests that the feedbacks dampen temperature perturbations, such as that from extra CO2. What the data says. The climate models have been essentially the same for 30 years now, maintaining roughly the same sensitivity to extra CO2, even while they got more detailed with more computer power. How well have the climate models predicted the temperature? Does the data better support the climate models or the skeptics' view? Air temperatures. One of the earliest and most important predictions was presented to the US Congress in 1988 by Dr. James Hansen, the father of global warming. Hansen's climate model clearly exaggerated future temperature rises. In particular, his climate model predicted that if human CO2 emissions were cut back drastically, starting in 1988, such that by the year 2000 the CO2 level was not rising at all, we would get his scenario C.
But in reality, the temperature did not even rise this much, even though our CO2 emissions strongly increased, which suggests that the climate models greatly overestimate the effect of CO2 emissions. A more considered prediction by the climate models was made in 1990 in the IPCC's first assessment report. It's 20 years now, and the average rate of increase in reality is below the lowest trend in the range predicted by the IPCC. Ocean temperatures. The oceans hold the vast bulk of the heat in the climate system. We've only been measuring ocean temperatures properly since mid-2003, when the Argo system became operational. In Argo, a buoy duck dives down to a depth of 2,000 meters, measures temperatures as it very slowly ascends, then radios the results back to headquarters via satellite. Over 3,000 Argo buoys constantly patrol all the oceans of the world. The ocean temperature has been basically flat since we started measuring it properly and not warming as quickly as the climate models predict. Atmospheric hotspot. The climate models predict a particular pattern of atmospheric warming during periods of global warming. The most prominent change they predict is a warming in the tropics about 10 kilometers up, the hotspot. The hotspot is the sign of the amplification in their theory. The theory says the hotspot is caused by extra evaporation and by extra water vapor pushing the warmer, wetter, lower troposphere up into volume previously occupied by cool, dry air. The presence of a hotspot would indicate amplification is occurring, and vice versa. We have been measuring atmospheric temperatures with weather balloons since the 1960s. Millions of weather balloons have built up a good picture of atmospheric temperatures over the last few decades, including the warming period from the late 1970s to the late 90s. This important and pivotal data was not released publicly by the climate establishment until 2006, and then in an obscure place. Here it is. On the left is the data collected by millions of weather balloons. On the right is what the climate models say was happening. The theory, as per the climate models, is incompatible with the observations. In both diagrams, the horizontal axis shows latitude, and the right vertical axis shows height in kilometers. In reality, there was no hotspot, not even a small one. So, in reality, there is no amplification. The amplification shown in Figure 1 does not exist. Outgoing radiation. The climate models predict that when the surface of the Earth warms, less heat is radiated from the Earth into space on a weekly or monthly timescale. This is because, according to the theory, the warmer surface causes more evaporation, and thus there is more heat-trapping water vapor. This is the heat-trapping mechanism that is responsible for the assumed amplification in Figure 1. Satellites have been measuring the radiation emitted from the Earth for the last 2 decades. A major study has linked the changes in temperature on the Earth's surface with the changes in the outgoing radiation. Here are the results. Outgoing radiation from Earth, vertical axis, against sea surface temperature, horizontal, as measured by the ERBE satellites, upper left graph, and as predicted by 11 climate models, the other graphs. Notice that the slopes for the graphs for the climate models are opposite to the slope of the graph for the observed data. This shows that, in reality, the Earth gives off more heat when its surface is warmer. This is the opposite of what the climate models predict. This shows that the climate models trap heat too aggressively and that their assumed amplification, shown in Figure 1, does not exist. Conclusions. All the data here is impeccably sourced: satellites, Argo, and weather balloons. The air and ocean temperature data shows that the climate models overestimate temperature rises. The climate establishment suggests that cooling due to undetected aerosols might be responsible for the failure of the models to date. But this excuse is wearing thin. It continues not to warm as much as they said it would, or in the way they said it would. On the other hand, the rise in air temperature has been greater than skeptics say could be due to CO2. The skeptics' excuse is that the rise is mainly due to other forces, and they point out that the world has been in a fairly steady warming trend of 0.5 degrees Celsius per century since 1680, with alternating about 30-year periods of warming and mild cooling, whereas the vast bulk of all human CO2 emissions have been after 1945. We've checked all the main predictions of the climate models against the best data. Test. Air temperatures from 1988. Climate models overestimated rise, even if CO2 is drastically cut. Air temperatures from 1990. Climate models overestimated trend rise. Ocean temperatures from 2003. Climate models overestimated trend rise greatly. Atmospheric hotspot. Climate models completely missing, therefore no amplification. Outgoing radiation, climate models opposite to reality, therefore no amplification. The climate models get them all wrong. The missing hotspot and outgoing radiation data both independently prove that the amplification in the climate models is not present. Without the amplification, the climate model temperature predictions would be cut by at least 2/3, which would explain why they overestimated the recent air and ocean temperature increases. Therefore, 1. The climate models are fundamentally flawed. Their assumed threefold amplification by feedbacks does not in fact exist. 2. The climate models overestimate temperature rises due to CO2 by at least a factor of 3. The skeptical view is compatible with the data. Some political points. The data presented here is impeccably sourced, very relevant, publicly available, and from our best instruments. Yet it never appears in the mainstream media. Have you ever seen anything like any of the figures here in the mainstream media? That alone tells you that the debate is about politics and power, and not about science or truth. This is an unusual political issue because there is a right and a wrong answer, and everyone will know which it is eventually. People are going ahead and emitting CO2 anyway, so we are doing the experiment. Either the world heats up by several degrees by 2050 or so, or it doesn't. Notice that the skeptics agree with the government climate scientists about the direct effect of CO2. They just disagree about the feedbacks. The climate debate is all about the feedbacks. Everything else is merely a sideshow. Yet hardly anyone knows that. The government climate scientists and the mainstream media have framed the debate in terms of the direct effect of CO2 and sideshows such as Arctic ice, bad weather, or psychology. They almost never mention the feedbacks. Why is that? Who has the power to make that happen?
This is Abby. She and her husband, Tom, are trying to start a family while struggling to afford the high cost of living in California. Abby and Tom have been saving every penny that they can to afford the down payment on a new home, which they're hoping to move into before their first child arrives. This has been no easy task, given that homes in California are more than 2 times as expensive as they are in the rest of the country. Abby and Tom finally have enough to begin searching for a home when...
And so it is decided that all new homes must be built with solar panels.
But won't that increase the cost of the average home by $10,000? And won't the cost of inspections, cleanings, and repairs also cost homeowners an average of another $1,000 annually? And isn't California already the poorest state in the union when factoring in cost of living? Wouldn't this likely be the biggest and costliest change in the last 40 years of the CPIA's history, at a time when regular Californians are struggling horribly?
No! Now we'll never be able to afford a home.
But at least the environment will be helped?
Maybe, maybe not. Solar energy has its benefits, sure, but it has a lot of drawbacks as well. Because most energy consumption takes place at night when the sun isn't shining, lots of energy needs to be stored in batteries, which are terrible for the environment. Not only that, but it's extremely expensive. Germany, which leads the world in solar energy consumption, has some of the highest utility bills because of it, and solar still only accounts for less than 10% of their energy consumption.
I guess not everyone can appreciate the genius of our policymaking.
Hey folks, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please check out fee.org for more educational content. Thank you.
Eu também não era muito avançado e por isso, quando víamos aviões da Segunda Guerra Mundial e os aviões largavam às vezes pacotes de comida, fizeram uma estátua com quem faz um deus para pedir mais comida. Depois eu queria também. O meu aconteceu nos Zimbábue, eu fui invadido pelos pretos e Zâmbia. A única exceção é que, por aí, aquelas houve tribos que eram por aqui, por isso também provavelmente algumas tribos que eram por aqui desceram. Mas isso foi há muito tempo, foi há muito mais de 14 ou 16 ou 17, há 20 mil anos fizeram isso. E, entretanto, possíveis tribos que ficaram daqui para aqui morreram muito antes de chegarmos à marca de apenas 10 mil anos atrás. Desceram por aqui e fizeram aqui o Lesoto. Lesoto. E pronto, e tirando. E o meu. Agora vão ficar criando aqui pequenas tribos, pelo caminho vão criando aqui umas pequenas tribos. Só que as tribos morrem. Há algum tempo desaparecem completamente porque. Morrem completamente, né? Há fome. Tribos não costumam durar muito tempo, tribos. Antropólogos concordam que tribos não duram mais que algumas centenas de anos. Desaparecem completamente, ou porque se separam em outras. Os membros separam-se em outras tribos, ou simplesmente porque. Vida de coletor, recolhedor. Neste caso, até coisa. Por exemplo, uma coisa que as pessoas. Um mito que a sociedade vai espalhar é que a SIDA. O vírus HIV, né? A SIDA, o síndrome de imunidade imunológica adquirida, é uma coisa recente, exclusiva dos anos 80 e que foi espalhada pela CIA em África, ou que foi um acidente houve um acidente durante a vacinação em África da varíola e da como é que se chama aquela outra agora? Não me estou a lembrar. É aquela doença que o presidente da América da Segunda Guerra Mundial do Franklin Roosevelt tinha. Eu já estou assim um bocadinho coisa. Mas antropólogos e não arqueólogos, porque arqueólogos não servem para nada em estudos sociais de população, mas antropólogos e paleontólogos descobriram ossos que provam que o vírus da SIDA apareceu várias vezes em África. Por isso, quando os portugueses chegaram, só encontraram pretos. Só havia pretos em África, nesta zona aqui, Lesoto e em Cabinda, em Moçambique. Eu agora queria mostrar um vídeo de. Primeiro queria mostrar este vídeo do Condancula.
And now, the nations of the world. Brought to you by Count Dankula. Chelsea just cheap labour, alcoholism in that place that has all the rice. Filthy cockroaches and thieving wee gypsies in the place that got fucking nuked twice. Hitmen on scooters and edgy school shooters, and the one where the president's a cuck, the one where it's sunny, the one with no money, and the one that is completely fucked. Muslims and Muslims and Muslims and Muslims, and also that one with the Jews. All of the Slavs that removed the kebabs, and the ones that can't poo in the loo. Democrat backers and those pesky hackers, the one with the terrorist attacks, really hot women, the one with the famine and the one that want white people back, pedos and ladyboys, boomerang chuckers and that one that is really small, the mafia blackmailer, fat guy with nukes, build the fucking wall, AIDS, the one where they all touch kids, the one that has a really funny name and the one that can suck my dick.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody should subscribe.
Que é... Eu não concordo muito que Portugal tenha muito sol. Espanha, sim. Mas Portugal é um... e uma das razões porque a Europa tem agricultura, introduziu agricultura em África e tudo mais, é que na Europa é impossível viver de seres humanos que gastam imensa energia. É por isso que seres humanos são criaturas, são muito mais difíceis, hominídeos, não é só seres humanos, hominídeos, são animais muito mais complicados de nascer que qualquer outro animal. Quem já viu um parto humano ou um parto animal, reparem que o parto animal é muito mais complicado e as crianças são muito mais dependentes. Um recém-nascido humano é muito mais dependente do que, por exemplo, um bezerro acabado de nascer. Os humanos precisam de muita energia por causa de nós e hominídeos em geral, inclusivamente o Homo erectus, qual é o cérebro que têm. O Homo erectus tem um cérebro mais pequeno que o nosso, que mesmo assim já tem um cérebro demasiado grande comparado com, por exemplo, um orangotango ou um gorila. E o cérebro gasta muita energia. É uma das razões que nós não temos pelo. Nós perdemos o pelo na idade glaciar, que é a altura em que provavelmente precisaríamos de mais pelo, mas para arrefecer o corpo, porque o cérebro humano aquece imenso. E é fascinante a evolução humana. O simples facto de nós andarmos a pé permitiu que as mulheres, as primeiras mulheres, não sei se mulheres é o termo mais correto, mas as pessoas de sexo, os Homo erectus de sexo feminino, pudessem tomar conta das crianças enquanto estavam a apanhar vagas, e isto aumentou o cérebro. Aumentou o cérebro, a pessoa ficou um bocado mais inteligente, permitiu, e não é só também aumentar o cérebro, aumentou também o número de ligações, aumentou o número de proteínas. Seres humanos começaram a fazer coisas, começaram a caçar melhor, começaram a construir instrumentos, ficar mais inteligentes, construíram melhores instrumentos, caçaram melhor, consumiram mais proteínas e pronto. Com a agricultura foi um salto exponencial, com a agricultura e com o gado, e é como eu digo, a introdução, por exemplo, a África é muito bom para a agricultura, tem um bom clima, a terra é extremamente fértil, e ao contrário da Europa, que a Europa tem o inverno em que é frio, é gelado, é úmido, e a África tem várias épocas em que a pessoa pode recolher os alimentos, épocas de colheita. A Europa não, a Europa tem uma. Se há um inverno um bocadinho mais pesado, é por isso também certos mecanismos sociais foram desenvolvidos na Europa, porque às vezes tem que se guardar um bocado de alimento para um pior inverno. Em África isso não é necessário. Não é necessário desenvolver tanta agricultura porque em África não foi preciso desenvolver agricultura porque não é? Há vagas e há coisas. Na Europa, se uma população tentasse sobreviver apenas com vagas e caça, morria rapidamente. A população da Europa era mesmo muito baixa quando chegássemos, por exemplo, a 1400. Não havia assim alternativa em que nunca foi desenvolvida na Europa a civilização e a agricultura e estávamos como, por exemplo, a Ilha Sentinal, que nós vimos há um bocado. Provavelmente a população europeia agora na Europa teria umas centenas de pessoas só. Pronto, eu queria mostrar este vídeo da situação do Zimbábue e que também um bocadinho relacionado com o que acabei de falar.
Earlier today, I was scrolling down my wall on minds.com and came across a YouTube video of a Black Rhodesian war veteran begging whites to come back to help rebuild Zimbabwe now that Mugabe is gone. Well, allow me to offer this very simple reply. No. Whites built Rhodesia on previously unoccupied territory. After they had created civilization in that geographical locale, blacks moved into it because there they could have access to industrial farming and food production, education, medical treatment, roads, trade, jobs, and nearly all of the infrastructure of a first world nation, which Rhodesia was on the cusp of becoming. As soon as blacks had moved in great enough numbers, they decided to take over what whites had built, seizing the country of Rhodesia and renaming it Zimbabwe. Whites stayed. They owned land. They worked and operated medical treatment, roads, trade, jobs, and nearly all of the infrastructure of a first world nation, which Rhodesia was on the cusp of becoming. As soon as blacks had moved in great enough numbers, they decided to take over what whites had built, seizing the country of Rhodesia and renaming it Zimbabwe. Whites stayed. They owned land. They worked and operated right alongside blacks in Zimbabwe. The farmland, under white control, not only produced enough food for the native Zimbabweans, but created a surplus. That surplus of food was not only a major economic boon to Zimbabwe, but was the principal source of food for much of Central Africa. Yet, that wasn't enough. So in June of 2014, Mugabe decided to push out.
2014 foi muito. 2014 foi há muito pouco tempo. Foi mais ou menos na altura que também começou esta crise de imigrantes. Porque as pessoas depois falam desta miséria toda que eles próprios provocaram.
The white farmers, not only expropriating their lands without compensation, but refusing to prosecute any murders of whites. By February of 2016, Zimbabwe was so devoid of food because they couldn't produce the harvests which the industrial white farmers had. Zimbabwe was begging the UN for $1.5 billion in aid to prevent mass starvation. Now hear this. You made your bed. You lay in it. Starve and die. After you're gone, whites will move back in, walking over your emaciated corpses and begin rebuilding the civilization which you took by force but were not capable of maintaining. You know, I suppose a more accurate statement would be, you dug your grave, you lay in it. Oh, don't worry, we'll be along shortly, to throw the dirt in. It's a courtesy we'll provide. We'll make sure you all get buried, and we'll even be kind enough to mark the graves. Maybe even build a monument and hold ceremonies. You see, it's in white people's nature to care for others. That's why whites stayed and remained part of Zimbabwe even after the fall of Rhodesia. That's also why whites stayed till the bitter end, right up until Mugabe signed the order expropriating their property. They tried to stay as long as possible to save all of your worthless hides. They tried to remain as long as possible, producing the food which would sustain your existence. That is the nature of white people. There are, however, limitations to our altruism. Starve to death. Watch with eyes filled with tears as your children wither away in front of you. As the whites were forced to watch their families slaughtered by machete-wielding mobs and thugs.
Em Moçambique há imensos portugueses, ainda há imensos portugueses que foram amputados durante a guerra colonial, que não é bem uma guerra, foram ataques terroristas, é o que aquilo era. Não é? Era a mesma coisa que alguém aqui no Porto, num bairro social, por exemplo, um grupo de imigrantes começasse a andar aos tiroteios para ver se precisava fazer coisa. O que já aconteceu no bairro da Beleza, já aconteceu algo assim parecido, não no Porto, mas em Lisboa. Mas é a mesma coisa do que um grupo de imigrantes, barra invasor, num bairro de Lisboa ou num bairro do Porto, começassem a andar aos tiros, e por causa disso Portugal, porque tinha pena deles, simplesmente abandonou. Neste caso seria Portugal, no caso que aconteceu mesmo no mundo real, Moçambique, Angola e por aí adiante.
Persecuted for the crime of...
Eu estava nenhum angolano branco, não é? Nenhum verdadeiramente angolano, não o grupo que invadiu através desta imigração. Não se esqueçam, pretos em Angola ou em Moçambique não eram mais do que a porcentagem de pretos em Angola e Moçambique, por exemplo, no século XVII, relativamente recente, não era mais do que a população atualmente de afro-americanos na América.
Sustaining your lives. Embrace your fate. You deserve nothing more. You did not speak out against the violence committed against the whites. You did not stand shoulder to shoulder with whites against the mobs who sought their blood. You have no moral authority. You have no ethical grounds. You have no right to ask or beg or plead for white people to come back and save you after you did nothing to save them from a reign of terror which saw their families brutally slaughtered like animals and the expropriation of their land which they had built and later maintained for the purpose of feeding your greedy mouths and your grumbling bellies, taken from them by official order. You dug your grave, you lay in it. And to South Africa, I say, look on Zimbabwe.
E falando em África do Sul, vejam o comentário Farmland. Por favor, vejam o comentário Farmland. Eu não tenho maneira de dizer isso mais claro. Por favor, vejam este comentário Farmland. Até diz uma pessoa em português, caso não queiram ver só com... Mas por favor, vejam este comentário Farmland. Não este. De Lawrence Sondner. Está no meu canal. Por favor, vejam este comentário. É uma coisa que eu peço-vos. Vejam este comentário. Este comentário devia já ter dado na televisão. Por isso que a mainstream media não se pode confiar. Este tipo que paga com os nossos impostos não se pode confiar, porque se fossem pessoas confiar e se não houvesse interesse em não mostrar isto, mostravam este vídeo horas e 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 horas. Concordo? Não é reverso, é racismo, não é reverso de racismo. E racismo contra brancos, eu acho que é pior, porque os brancos, em muitos aspectos, são os que sustentam o resto do mundo. E brancos e os asiáticos são essencialmente quem sustenta o resto do mundo. Um bocado forte a palavra. Eu percebo porque ele diz isto. Talvez um bocado forte. Talvez. Provavelmente um bocadinho forte. Não quero meter a coisa porque... E, claro, judeus, claro, tinha que ser. É interessante que já temos os nossos inimigos eu não estou a dizer que os nossos inimigos, estou a dizer golvistas. E eu provavelmente tenho descendência judaica, não tenho a ser, porque provavelmente todos os portugueses têm 10,1%, 10,2% descendência judaica. A palavra sabes em português vem da palavra sabá, do judaico. Não é? Então aqueles judeus, os judeus da Holanda são portugueses, têm passado em Portugal, não são portugueses, mas têm passado em Portugal todos. Inclusive Ana Frank, claro que Ana Frank não existiu, mas o Holocausto existiu, mas Ana Frank especificamente não existiu. Um bocado forte este aqui, mas eu percebo de onde é que ele vem. Agora este aqui não, este aqui é... Isso aconteceu mesmo e há vários vídeos, e há várias provas. Por exemplo, aqui Black Vision.
Hi. So, by request, there will be a limited sale of BPS and BPS inspired the ready-made country they had built over to the black majority with the assurances that the new rainbow nation that would be created would have a place for all South Africans, no matter the skin color. Now, 20-something years later, the country has one of the highest murder rates in the world, one of the highest HIV rates in the world, infrastructure that is degrading to the point where essential services like water in large cities like Cape Town may not even be able to be distributed in the near future because of systemic failure and corruption in the political class. By any metric, South Africa looks set to join the rest of sub-Saharan Africa as its newest failed state. However, news that the nation will now amend its constitution to allow the seizure of white-owned land without compensation will almost certainly accelerate the collapse of the country. Zimbabwe 2.0 incoming.
Has to say.
And we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And
Okay, the world is going to end in 12 years. Now, this sounds like crazy lunatic hysteria, but it is crazy lunatic hysteria from our good old friends of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. There's only a dozen years left to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They say any higher, even by half a degree, would significantly increase risks of floods, drought, extreme heat, and potential poverty for hundreds of millions. So, as you've probably been aware, there was an 18-year pause in global warming, and quite a lot has happened to keep the mathematical models from coming into existence. But she is very, very concerned. So she says, basically, we have just a tiny bit of time.
Years if we don't address climate change. And it's going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And
Okay, so the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
your biggest issue is your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it?
I'm sorry, it's the tonality. How are you going to pay for it? So the biggest issue is how you're going to pay for it. Well, that does matter. Not the first pretty woman I've ever seen who doesn't have any clue how finances work, but, there's Justin Trudeau. So, your biggest concern is how you're going to pay for it. Well, now, here's the thing. So, if this young lady, she's 29? 29. I remember it vaguely. So, if this young lady is very, very concerned about climate change, then there's something very simple that needs to be done, which is going to do more than just about anything else you can think of, and that is to stop bringing people from the third world to the first world. Absolutely the number one thing that needs to be done is stop mass migration of millions and millions and millions of people from third world countries to first world countries. Why is that? Well, because, of course, when you move from a third world country to a first world country, your carbon footprint goes up dozens of times. You end up consuming far more resources. You get your free housing, you get your free MacBook Air, you get your free money, you get your free healthcare. All of this consumes massive amounts of resources. So you absolutely want to stop mass migration, or really migration at all, from the third world to the first world. It's just 12 years. And until we can get a handle on this kind of stuff, right? So, and the UN, of course, if you did watch my video on the United Nations and their Global Migration Compact, I mean, it's the UN, so you can't expect any consistency except in banning DDT and killing 60 million people as a result. But if the United Nations is so terrified of global warming, then clearly they should put a halt on human migration, because people can live in their own countries. But if everybody piles into the first world, Mother Nature gets destroyed, and that's it. So you can't have both in a rational universe. Okay, you're in the UN, so you're not in a rational universe, but you can't have both in any rational universe. You would have to say, well, if we're really, really worried about carbon emissions, we have to stop migration. But no, they want massive migration, and they want massive taxation and regulation to control climate change. These two are complete opposites. And, there was a big debate way back in the day. This is I guess, the advantage of being slightly older than 29. But there was a big debate back in the day among environmentalist groups, like, should we stop immigration? Should we oppose immigration? And, of course, the magic two-syllable word, racist, was used. And, of course, then everybody had to shut up and go along with it. And there were some, at least one that I can think of, you can look it up. It was an environmentalist group that took a huge amount of money from benefactors in return for never bringing up immigration. So that's number one. The second thing, of course, if you care about climate change and if you care about the environment, as we all do, then you have to crush government spending immediately. Because government spending, unfunded liabilities, and debt in particular, right? Debt is the consumption of future resources in the present, right? So if you go $100 billion in debt, that means you've spent $100 billion that you don't have, which means you've consumed $100 billion worth of nature's scarce resources and left less for the future, right? So when it comes to this, she should say, hey, I love people south of the border, but, sorry guys, for the sake of saving Gaia, for the sake of saving Mother Earth, for the sake of ensuring that we have any kind of habitable planet for future generations, you guys got to stay south of the border. We got to build this wall. We're going to build this wall because people are pouring in using huge amounts of extra resources. So, right. So, but it's nothing to do with that, right? It's nothing to do with that. I mean, they're just, they're trying to figure out as much as humanly possible that they can tax. And if you can tax energy, fantastic. Now, of course, the primary greenhouse gas component, 90%, sometimes it's been rated as high as 95%, the very highest greenhouse gas component in the atmosphere is water vapor, right? So water vapor, you've got 400 odd parts per billion of carbon dioxide, but you have 90 to 95% of the greenhouse gas componentry is water vapor. Now, of course, they can't really classify water vapor as a pollutant. They can classify CO2 as a pollutant, although it's actually plant food. But that is the reality. That it's about taxation and it's about control. So let's hear what else she has to say.
And this is the war. This is our World War II.
Again, it gives a lot of vets of, this is our World War II. But okay, so this is World War II. This is a massive effort to prevent the worst possible catastrophe from overtaking the planet. This is World War II. Nothing should be spared in terms of human effort. Yeah, World War II slaughtered, 50 million people. Countries like Germany and Japan were bombed from end to end. And so, boy, the people were rationed. It was incredible, the amount of sacrifice. Like when I grew up in London, England, you'd regularly walk down the street and you'd see in front of these buildings, there'd be these low walls and there'd be all these holes in them. You'd say, I remember asking, what are those holes? My mom said, I remember very clearly, my mom, she grew up in Germany in the wars. It was a bad time for her. But my mom said that's where they used to have the railings, and they pulled them all out to make airplanes and bombs and bullets. They pulled all the railings out, and that's why there are just holes left in the ground. So no amount of sacrifice should be too great in order to combat global warming, because it's our World War II, right? Men got drafted, men got their heads blown off, right? Bodies scattered all across the world. So what you would clearly want to do is you would clearly want to end the welfare state, because the welfare state, you see, pays women to have children. And so you would definitely want to end the welfare state in order to, well, first of all, you can control immigration by ending the welfare state, because I imagine 90% of immigration will absolutely collapse if there's no welfare state to get to, right? It's right. You can see all of these people coming from the Middle East. They go through all of these countries that are perfectly safe havens just to get to the countries that have the highest welfare benefits. And so you simply get rid of the welfare state, and then you control immigration, don't even have to change the laws, and you say, wow, that's going to be tough for women. Yeah, it is going to be tough for women. For sure, it's going to be tough for a lot of people. And, you know, in World War II, funny story, not funny story, it was really, really tough for men in World War II because, as I mentioned, they got drafted, they got their heads blown off, they were separated, they were traumatized. I mean, it was absolutely wretched what happened. So in this particular instance, right, so women say that, you know, they're empowered, they're strong, equal to a man, right? And they're ready to stand alongside men in society. Okay, well, so I guess, roughly speaking, for about the last 150,000 years or so, 150,000, maybe 40,000 or so for East Asians and whites, tens of thousands of years, let's say. So for tens of thousands of years, men have had to go to war, and women didn't. And if they were conquered, women can always land on their backs, right? So for tens of thousands of years, it's men who've had to make the sacrifice in order to save civilization, to save societies, to save the world that women and children live in. And now, once in human history, women are going to have to make the sacrifice. Now, what is that sacrifice? Do they have to get drafted? Do they have to go and get their heads blown off? Do they have to go get traumatized? Do they, any of this sort of stuff? No. No, they have to find a way to survive without massive government handouts. That means that they can get a man. That means they can double up or triple up. That means that they can all get together, they can watch each other's kids while people go off to work, and it can be handled, it can be managed, right? Because it's World War II. And now, finally, women get to take their side of the sacrifice relative to what men have had to do all the way throughout human history. So, of course, it's not going to happen. But, logically, it should be a conversation, right? So what does she say?
And I think for younger people, we're looking at this and we're like, how are we saying let's take it easy when 3,000 Americans died last year? How are we saying let's take it easy?
I don't know what she's referring to, but I assume it's something to do, because she talks about the justice system, something to do with dying in custody or something like that. And it's like, yeah, well, I mean, tens of thousands of Americans died from suicide, opioid crisis, and all these kinds of things, right? Absolutely wretched. And a lot of that has to do with this very porous southern border wherein a huge amount of drugs come charging across. So again, if you're really, really concerned about that, but anyway, so.
When the nth person has just died from our cruel and unjust criminal justice system.
Right, so she's talking, this Tom's the black fellow, right? So naturally she has to talk about this cruel and unjust criminal justice system. And this is all the way back to the standard talking point on the left, which is because blacks and Hispanics.
Se o sistema é tão discriminador e racista, por que eles continuam a vir? Por que eles não aproveitaram quando a Libéria foi fundada e não foram? Por que em vez? A partir de 1952, quando foi criado o National Act, eles em vez de irem da Libéria, por exemplo, que tem a mesma Constituição, exatamente a mesma Constituição da América, por que não foram para... em vez de irem para a América ou para a Europa, porque não foram para a Libéria? Tem exatamente a mesma Constituição da América e tudo. Não é? Ou para a Uganda, ou para o Congo, não. Vêm sempre a esses países. Os países que eles dizem que são racistas e que discriminam e injustos, porque que não vês Se eles acham que a Europa, a América, o Canadá e o Japão são... que é que não vão então para o Congo? Não é? Para países onde supostamente eles dizem que não é racista e que não é? Ou para Angola, para Moçambique, que são países que foram fundados pelos europeus, no caso de Angola e Moçambique pelos portugueses, mas que nós não abandonamos, nós fomos expulsos e agora nós vamos a dar um território que nós criamos para eles viverem lá em vez de viver cá. Não se esqueçam. Moçambique e Angola, não se esqueçam disso. Moçambique e Angola não eram habitados antes dos europeus chegarem lá. Tirando, no caso de Moçambique, tirando Carolina. Mas o resto, já vi aquele vídeo que vocês já viram, Angola e Moçambique, tirando Carolina, não era habitado. E ele é que invadiram, vindo do Congo e da República do Congo, da República de partes do Congo, partes da República vocês viram o vídeo.
Hispanics get arrested more than whites and East Asians and Jews, then it must be racist. And it's like, no, there's no data to support that. In fact, all the data supports that the reality is that blacks and Hispanics commit a huge amount more crime than East Asians and Jews. And this is true of blacks all over the world. Blacks commit huge amounts more crime. You know, whether like Haiti, they've been out of colonialism for hundreds and hundreds of years, or South Africa, the rape capital of the world, or Detroit, or Chicago, like wherever you have a substantial black population, you have massive amounts of crime for reasons I've gone into. You can check out my presentation on the truth about crime. And so there's this, partly I think it's these IQ differences, partly there's a toxic culture, this single motherhood, 3/4 of blacks being raised in single, being born to unmarried women, and this used to be much, much lower back in the 1940s and the 1950s, even earlier, so it's not the result of racism unless you're going to say there was less racism back then. And so you have to make this talking point that every single time there's a disparity in outcomes between groups, it is the result of bigotry. And it's not true. Blacks are arrested at particular proportions that match almost perfectly to victim crime reports, right? I mean, you wouldn't sit there and be raped by some black guy and then say, oh, no, it was a white guy who did it. Or be raped by some East Asian guy, should that ever happen, and say, no, it was a Hispanic who did it, right? I mean, because it wouldn't make any sense, and wouldn't be any... If you're going to pursue the justice, you want to see the guy caught, so the last thing you're going to do is start lying about race, because it's not going to get caught, right? So, yeah, but she has to say it's this unjust system, right? No, the system is, it's tragic, right? I mean, 1/3 of young black men are somewhere in the justice system. That's more than graduating from college, and there's some stuff that can be done about it, like peaceful parenting and black dads staying together. But all that has to do with ending the welfare state. But she has to say this kind of stuff because you can't tell the truth. Boy, you ever want to find out how terrible the educational system is in the West and how much people are addicted to lying to themselves? Just bring up some uncomfortable truths, as I've been doing on Twitter. You should follow my Twitter account. I've really stepped it up a smidge at Stefan Molyneux. I'll put the link below. But, so let's go on.
We're saying take it easy when the America that we're living in today is so dystopian, with people sleeping in their cars so that they can work a second job without health care.
Okay. So yes, dystopian. It's interesting. So if America is dystopian, then we should keep people from moving to America, particularly if America is a racist country, then we should certainly prevent non-whites from coming to America because it's so racist. Like, they may be fooled into thinking it's a good country, but she knows, right? And everybody knows who's on that side of the fence, that America is this horrible, racist, white privileged, white supremacist society, and therefore, just for the sake of kindness, we should make sure that people don't get exposed to that who aren't white or East Asian, say. So that is something that she talks about. And the other thing too, let's just go back here for a sec.
Living in today is so dystopian, with people sleeping in their cars.
So dystopian, right? Okay. So who educates everyone in America? It's so weird to me, as somebody who looks at things rationally, it's so weird to me that people are constantly saying, oh, America this and the West that and so on. And it's like, well, who gets to educate the children for 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 years just from sort of pre-K or daycare all the way up to high school and so on, right? who gets 10 to 15 years or so to educate the children. And if the society is dysfunctional, then it must have something to do with the education. In which case, we should really review the educational system and look back to what worked. And what worked was much cheaper and better educational systems in the past, where you could get educated for $50 to $100 in contemporary money, in like today's currency, $50 to $100 a year. Kids would teach each other, and they would learn skills from those above and pass those skills down, because, you know, the way that you really know something is when you can teach it to someone. That's when you really know that you know it. So there were much, much better schools in the past. Massachusetts, I think, had a 98% literacy rate before the introduction of government schools. And, you know, there were no government schools when Dickens was popular, when Shakespeare, well, Dickens was, I guess it was just coming in, but there were still mostly teachers in the private school system or the free market system. There were no government schools or very little government education when Shakespeare was very popular, right? And people say, well, Shakespeare went to government schools. It's like, yeah, but only 12 weeks a year. It wasn't very much. So it's weird to me that people say, there's these big problems with America. And they never say, so we've really got to revisit this educational system. We've really got to, you know, just start it from scratch. It's a terrible system. Always pass right over that whole educational system. And of course, right, because Democrats get their money from teachers' unions, right? So they don't want to mess with the educational system. So they'll blame, you know, white racism.
They can work a second job without health care, and we're told to settle down.
Who's telling anyone to settle down? I mean, it's kind of weird to me.
It's a fundamental separation between, you know, that fierce urgency of now, the why we can't wait.
Yes, the fierce urgency of now. That is fascinating, and you see that so much. There's a whole branch, and sometimes it seems to be just about all of moral philosophy called, you can refer to it as the ethics of emergencies. You know, like you're in a lifeboat and, you know, like you don't have enough water for everyone. Or, you know, one I did years ago is there's a guy hanging off a lamppost. Can he kick in your window to save his life rather than fall to the ground? Or is it okay to steal if your children are starving and can you steal a loaf of bread? Is that moral? And so ethics, when you combine ethics with emergencies, ethical standards just dissolve, right? Because nobody's going to sit there and say, well, I'm going to respect the property rights of the baker rather than steal a loaf of bread to feed my starving child who will otherwise die, right? Of course, right? So what they do is they try and create all these emergencies so that you will say, well, human life trumps property rights, therefore welfare state is good, right? I mean, so if they can keep you in a state of perpetual panic, ooga booga, right? Perpetual panic, then you're going to give up your moral standards, right? There are you know, as they say, there are no atheists in foxholes, but ethical, reasoned considerations tend to fall by the wayside in emergencies, which is why they're constantly summoning these undead, giant golem hobgoblins from hell to loom over you and scare the living bejesus out of you. We only have, it's like that. It's not a great Queen song, Flash, right? But General, we only have 14 hours to save the Earth or whatever. So it's like, we only have 12 years to save the Earth. What are you talking about property rights? Well, it's an emergency. We don't have time, right? They want to keep you in a state of perpetual panic so that you don't sit there and reason things through, right? Because for the catastrophic anthropogenic climate change scenario to be true and valid and to end up with this massive amount of government control, then the increase in CO2 that's been observable since the 18th century would have to, A, be primarily caused by human beings, B, would have to be catastrophic, C, would have to be remediable in some manner, and D, the government would have to be the very best and only way to do it. And of course governments don't care about the future. If governments cared about the future, we wouldn't have a national debt. Of course, if governments cared about the future, there'd be honest conversations about immigration, which there isn't. So that, all those things have to be true in order for you to want a government program to control CO2, right? I mean, the CO2 is rising, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Nobody disputes that who's got any brains about the matter. But is it primarily human caused? Is it catastrophic? Can it be remediated? And is the government the very best vehicle for doing that? All of those things have to be true in order for you to support it. But they don't. They just say, doom, government. I mean, come on. This is crazy stuff. So, anyway, let's just listen for a minute or two more.
King spoke of, that at some point these chronic realities do reach a breaking point. And I think for our generation, it's reached that. And I wish I didn't have to be, doing every post, but sometimes I just feel like people aren't being held accountable.
Yes. Okay. So you go from generic problem to generic positive thing, like, holding people accountable. Now, if it comes to holding people accountable, I mean, it's insane what they're talking about. The Paris Climate Accord is talking about spending $100 trillion to affect the worldwide temperature by 2100 by a tiny fraction of 1%, by a tiny fraction of 1 degree. $100 trillion. Now, who's accountable? When there was a huge pause in global warming that no model predicted and no model can explain, who was held accountable? If she fails to provide what she wants, who is held accountable? How can someone dare to stand up there in the government and say people have to be held accountable? People in the government are never held accountable. Never held accountable. I mean, look at George Bush, the architect of the invasion of Iraq that killed, 500,000 Iraqis, destabilized the region, unleashed ISIS, and there has been, in Fallujah they used such horrible weapons that there had been permanent genetic corruption, like in Vietnam. JFK got him in. LBJ kept it going. Nixon ended it. And there are still birth defects from Agent Orange and other horrible weaponry in Vietnam decades and decades and decades after the end of the war. Who was held accountable? No one. No one is held accountable. The only way leaders are held accountable is if other leaders invade them and they get put on trial or they kill themselves. If you look at Libya, completely destroyed. From a fairly functioning, though brutal obviously, society, fairly functioning society to just complete chaos, warlords, open-air slave markets, you name it. That was under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Who's held accountable? Nobody's held accountable. So what is she talking about that it's something to do with holding people accountable? Think of the environmental damage that the Iraq war and the destruction of Libya and the destruction of Syria has engendered. Who's being held accountable? No one. It's just, I don't know. When people start talking about holding people accountable, they don't understand how government works. If anybody wanted to be held accountable, like I want to be held accountable, so I don't work in the government. I work for you.
And until we all start pitching in and holding people accountable, I'm just going to let them have it.
How are you going to hold people accountable, Alex? How are you going to hold people in government accountable? I don't know what any of this means. Like, once we understand, like, I mean, just look at the last 100 years. Just look at the last 100 years. Governments gained control, 100 plus, right? Gained control of the currency, can print whatever money they want. There was the First World War. There was the Spanish flu, which killed more people than the First World War did and was spread by returning soldiers to a weakened population. There was the massive inflationary boom driven up by the Federal Reserve in America, the stock market speculation and insanity of the 1920s. There was a giant crash in 1929. The Great Depression lasted for 13 years until the West slid into the most gruesome war in human history, Second World War. After that, there was the Cold War, there was the Korean War, there was the Vietnam War, there was the welfare state, there was stagflation in the 70s, there was a gas crisis, there was the boom and bust of the tech sector, there was the first invasion of Kuwait, and then there was the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, 9/11, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, it just goes on and on. Then the housing market crashed in 2007 to 2008. America has been at war for virtually all of its history. This is a country with giant oceans to the east and west and friendly neighbors to the north and south. if you discount the cannibals in Saskatchewan. So it's a terrible way to organize a society. It's a terrible way to organize a society. We need more freedom, we need more voluntarism, we need more choice in our lives. We're never going to get that. And this grinning person who's blathering on about holding people accountable and it's our World War II and the world's going to end in 12 years. People like this should not be in charge of a hot dog stand, let alone a society as a whole.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 30 Years of Failed Climate Predictions. 30 years ago today, NASA's James...
In 1971, I helped found an environmental group in the basement of a Unitarian church in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years later, it had grown into an international powerhouse. We were making headlines every month. I was famous, and then I walked out the door. The mission, once noble, had become corrupted. Political agendas and fear-mongering trumped science and truth. Here's how it happened. When I was studying for my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, I joined a small activist group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. It was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. I became radicalized by these realities and by the emerging consciousness of the environment. The mission of the Don't Make a Wave Committee was to launch an ocean-going campaign against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, a symbol of our opposition to nuclear war. As one of our early meetings was breaking up, someone said, "Peace." A reply came, "Why don't we make it a green peace?" And a new movement was born. Green was for the environment, and peace was for the people. We named our boat the Greenpeace, and I joined the 12-person crew for a voyage of protest. We didn't stop that H-bomb test, but it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. We had won a major victory. In 1975, Greenpeace took a sharp turn away from our anti-nuclear efforts and set out to save the whales, sailing the high seas to confront Russian and Japanese whalers. The footage we shot, young protesters positioned between harpoons and fleeing whales, was shown on TV around the world. Public donations poured in. By the early 1980s, we were campaigning against toxic waste, air pollution, trophy hunting, and the live capture of orca whales. But I began to feel uncomfortable with the course my fellow directors were taking. I found myself the only one of 6 international directors with a formal science background. We were now tackling subjects that involved complex issues of toxicology, chemistry, and human health. You don't need a PhD in marine biology to know it's a good thing to save whales from extinction. But when you're analyzing which chemicals to ban, you need to know some science. And the first lesson of ecology is that we are all interconnected. Humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Many other species, disease agents and their carriers, for example, are our enemies, and we have the moral obligation to protect human beings from these enemies. Biodiversity is not always our friend. I had noticed something else. As we grew into an international organization with over 100 million a year coming in, a big change in attitude had occurred. The peace in Greenpeace had faded away. Only the green part seemed to matter now. Humans, to use Greenpeace language, had become the enemies of the earth. Putting an end to industrial growth and banning many useful technologies and chemicals became common themes of the movement. Science and logic no longer held sway. Sensationalism, misinformation, and fear were what we used to promote our campaigns. The final straw came when my fellow directors decided that we had to work to ban the element chlorine worldwide.
They named chlorine the devil's element, as if it were evil. But this was absurd. Adding chlorine to drinking water was one of the biggest advances in the history of public health. And anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry knew that many of our most effective pharmaceuticals had a chlorine component. Not only that, but if this anti-chlorine campaign succeeded, it wouldn't be our wealthy donors who would suffer. Wealthy individuals and countries always find a way around these follies. The ones who suffer are those in developing countries, people we're presumably trying to help. For example, Greenpeace has opposed the adoption of golden rice, a genetically modified variety of rice that contains beta-carotene. Golden rice has the potential to prevent the death of 2 million of the world's poorest children every year. But that doesn't matter to the Greenpeace crowd. GMOs are bad, so golden rice must be bad. Apparently millions of children dying isn't. This kind of rigid, backward thinking.
Greenpeace. Nos países mais pobres, mais desenvolvidos, as crianças são culpadas por overpopulation e a invasão da Europa, não é? Porque as crianças tornam-se adultas com o tempo, e quando eu digo adultas, mais ou menos aos 12 anos, nem sequer são bem adultas, mas mais ou menos aos 12 anos têm os seus primeiros filhos, têm logo 12, por sua vez têm mais 12, por sua vez têm esses próprios, cada um deles tem 12, e este problema do overpopulation. E temos que cortar a ajuda humanitária, que para além de estar a roubar dinheiro, está o overpopulation em África e que não só faz mal ao clima, mas bem importante tudo, promove a invasão da Europa.
Carbon emissions are rising, and faster than most scientists predicted. But many climate change alarmists seem to claim that all climate change is worse than expected. This ignores that much of the data is actually more encouraging than expected. Yes, Arctic sea ice is melting faster than models expected, but models also predicted that Antarctic sea ice would decrease, yet Antarctic sea ice is increasing. Yes, sea levels are rising, but the rise is not accelerating. If anything, 2 recent papers, one by Chinese scientists published in January 2014 and the other by US scientists published in May 2013, have shown a small decline in the rate of sea level increase. We're often being told that we're seeing more and more droughts, but a study published in March 2014 in the journal Nature actually shows a decrease in the world's surface that has been afflicted by droughts since 1982. Facts like these are important because a one-sided focus on worst-case stories is a poor foundation for sound policies. Hurricanes are likewise used as an example of things getting worse. But look at the US, where we have the best statistics. If we adjust for population and wealth, hurricane damage during the period of 1900 to 2013 actually decreased slightly. At the UN Climate Conference in Lima, Peru, in December 2014, attendees were told that their countries should cut carbon emissions to avoid future damage from storms like Typhoon Hagupit, which hit the Philippines during the conference, killing at least 21 people and forcing more than 1 million into shelters. Yet the trend for strong typhoons around the Philippines have actually declined since 1950, according to a study published in 2012 by the Journal of Climate. Again, we're told that all things are getting worse, but the facts don't support this. This does not mean global warming is not real or a problem, but the one-sided story of a lot development, not a problem. Much has been made of the Paris Climate Agreement signed by the leaders of 178 countries in 2016. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, speaking for many, called it a historic turning point. The head of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy, echoed the minister's remark when she testified before the House Committee on Science, Space and Technology. The Paris Agreement was, she said, an incredible achievement. But when pressed by committee members to explain exactly how much this treaty would reduce global temperatures, she would not, or could not, say. This combination of grand pronouncements and vague specifics is a good strategy for Paris Agreement fans to take, because the agreement will cost a fortune but do little to reduce global warming. Consider the Obama administration's signature climate policy, the Clean Power Plan. Using the same climate prediction model that the UN uses, I found that the power plan will accomplish almost nothing. Even if its cuts to carbon dioxide emissions are fully implemented, not just for the 14 years that the Paris Agreement lasts, but for the rest of the century, the Clean Power Plan would reduce the temperature increase in 2100 by just 0.023 degrees Fahrenheit. The President has made further and grander promises of future U.S. carbon cuts, but these are only vaguely outlined. In the unlikely event that all of these extra cuts also happen and are adhered to throughout the rest of the century, the combined reduction in temperatures would be 0.057 degrees. To put it another way, if the U.S. delivers for the whole century on the President's very ambitious rhetoric, it would postpone global warming by about 8 months at the end of the century. Now, let's add in the rest of the world's Paris promises. If we generously assume that the promised carbon cuts for 2030 are not only met, which itself would be a UN first, but sustained throughout the rest of the century, temperatures in 2100 would drop by 0.3 degrees, the equivalent of postponing warming by less than 4 years. Again, that's using the UN's own climate prediction model. But here's the biggest problem. These minuscule benefits do not come free. Quite the contrary. The cost of the Paris Climate Pact is likely to run to $1 to $2 trillion every year, based on estimates produced by the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum and the Asia Modeling Exercise. In other words, we will spend at least $100 trillion in order to reduce the temperature by the end of the century by a grand total of 0.3 degree. Some Paris Agreement supporters defend it by claiming that its real impact on temperatures will be much more significant than the UN model predicts. But this requires mental gymnastics and heroic assumptions. The Climate Action Tracker, widely cited by Paris Agreement fans, predict a temperature reduction of 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. But this prediction is based very heavily on the assumption that even stronger climate policies will be adopted in the future. Actually, 98% of the assumed reductions will come only after 2030, which is what the current Paris Agreement covers. And even such wishful thinking won't achieve anything close to the 2 degrees Celsius reduction that has become the somewhat arbitrary but widely adopted benchmark to avoid the worst effects of global warming. The actual promised emission reductions under the Paris Agreement literally gets us just 1% of the way. With its
E nós sabemos todos porque é que a esquerda e os lobistas são a favor desta teoria que não tem qualquer tipo de base. São a favor porque é uma maneira de reduzir a população europeia e substituí-la mais rapidamente pelos imigrantes, não é? Porque se não fosse, eles não usavam o dinheiro recolhido pelo ISP, a carbon tax, os impostos, a quantidade enorme de impostos que nós pagamos pela eletricidade e por aí adiante, os impostos de carro e tudo mais, não usavam estes impostos para trazer mais imigrantes, não é? Não davam estes impostos para não davam estes impostos para pagar subsídios, não usavam estes impostos para meter carros elétricos gratuitamente, não. Os subsídios para carregar as pessoas pagavam, não é? Que já pagam menos impostos, por isso já não usavam não é, para dar subsídios, não é? O dinheiro que nós pagamos pelo ISP, a maior parte dele é usado para pagar subsídios de pensão de sobrevivência, que é uma coisa estúpida. Pensão de sobrevivência aos imigrantes. Já é mau, nós temos que pagar aos nossos. Ainda pagar aos imigrantes. Pronto. E é isso.